there any constituency statements by honourable members? I call the member for Kooyong.
Deputy Speaker, on the 29th of October, a tragic car accident caused the death of an 11-year-old boy and injuries to 4 other students from the Auburn South Primary School. On behalf of the Kooyong community, I want to mark our sadness at the loss of Jack Davey and the injuries to those other innocent children. I want to mark our gratitude to the school staff, particularly to its principal, Marcus Wicker, and to the staff member, Millie, who stayed with Jack throughout. I want to thank the policemen, the paramedics and the State Education Department. The school's staff and students have received hundreds of messages from other schools. People have come from everywhere to help. Last Tuesday was a sunny day in Melbourne. Parents dropped their kids off at school. They kissed them goodbye and they drove or they walked away without further thought. But by the end of that day, things had changed. We held our children tighter and we held them with grief. We knew that life is fragile and it is unpredictable and fleeting. Deputy Speaker, Jack loved football. He barracked for the Demons. He played baseball for the Titans and footy for the Gladiators. He was in a futsal team with other kids from his class. He was a beautiful boy and he's gone too soon. On behalf of all in the Kooyong community, I send our love and our sympathy to Jack's parents. To his parents, Michael and Jade, and to his sisters. We will all always keep Jack Davey in our hearts and our community will be there for them always.
I call the Assistant Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Bulk billing, the ability to see a GP without charge, is the critical core of Medicare. And the strength of our primary healthcare system literally determines at times whether people live or die and impacts every part of the health system. For people, particularly low-income earners, to be able to go to their GP without a charge rather than fronting up to the public hospital means conditions are picked up earlier, lowering cost of treatment overall, and saves expensive, very, very costly visits to emergency departments and clogging them up when conditions can be treated elsewhere. And the good news is, while there's more to do, things are finally improving on the bulk billing front. In 2022, when the government was elected, it's no exaggeration to say that bulk billing rates in this country were in free fall after a decade of the Liberals' cuts, neglect and a freeze to the bulk billing, or to the rate that GPs are paid. Now that's really important, because when you freeze the rate, as the previous government did, when you freeze the rate so doctors are paid the same year after year after year after year, they have no choice. And it was such a difficult decision for so many GPs in the suburbs and the regions to make, to start charging their patients, because it was the only way that they could pay their staff, pay their insurance, pay their rent and earn some modicum of a wage. Now, who was the health minister, you may well ask, that started this cycle of neglect and cuts? Well, surprise, surprise, it's the now opposition leader, Peter Dutton. He said, I direct quote, he said it made no sense for Australians to expect to access a GP for free. Well, at least he's consistent. It's comparable with his brilliant idea when he was the health minister to charge Australians to access hospital emergency departments. It's no wonder that the medical profession, the doctors, voted him literally the worst health minister Australia has had in 40 years. Now, 1 year ago, I'm proud that this government made the largest investment in bulk billing in the history of Medicare, tripling the bulk billing incentive, restoring or moving back towards that core principle, that Labor principle, that it's your Medicare card, not your credit card, which determines your access to healthcare. In the last 12 months since that change, an extra 5.4 million bulk billing visits have occurred. That's more than 103,000 bulk bill visits to the GP every week. There's more work to do, but that is real progress, Deputy Speaker. We've also put in place Medicare urgent clinics, 7 days a week, extended hours, bulk billed for non-life-threatening conditions, but things that are too urgent to wait to see a GP, to keep people out of the public hospital waiting rooms. In my electorate, the Narrogate Clinic in Narre Warren, that's more than 15,000 people have been bulk billed over the last year or so. We've made medicines cheaper with more than $1 billion of savings, cutting costs, 60-day scripts, lowering the safety net threshold. It's a fundamental contrast with Peter Dutton, the worst health minister in 40 years.
Call the member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Collinsville residents have been calling for reliable telecommunications, not as a luxury but as an essential service that is frankly overdue. With a poor response from the Minister for Communications to my correspondence regarding this very issue, I visited Collinsville with the Telstra representative so that they could hear from the community directly. At this public meeting, I listened as locals shared their frustrations, anger and even fear about the lack of mobile coverage. For them, this isn't a minor inconvenience, it is a crisis. Locals who live in constant fear for loved ones with serious medical conditions, who know that in an emergency they may not be able to call for help. Small businesses whose day-to-day work is impacted and affecting their bottom line, while community nurses who provide care to Collinsville's most vulnerable are unable to complete their paperwork on the ground with their patients. Imagine being in that position. Imagine the frustration. This would never be tolerated in our capital cities, so why should it be acceptable in regional Australia? Following this meeting with promises for an upgrade to their telecommunication tower sometime in this financial year, I made an urgent appeal directly to Telstra's CEO, asking her to prioritise this essential upgrade. The response I received was both frustrating and disheartening. Rather than committing to resolve the ongoing issues, these pleas were dismissed, citing a lack of funding for much-needed improvements. In response to my letter, it stated that while Telstra has plans to improve mobile performance in the Collinsville area, they simply don't have the funds to make it happen right now. Labor often boasts about record spending on regional telecommunications, yet here we are. One of the major telecommunication providers in this country claims they can't afford to deliver these essential upgrades. This reveals a disturbing disconnect between what the government says and what is actually being delivered. Rural and remote communities like Collinsville are sick of hearing about promises of funding that never seem to reach them. And let's be clear, this is not just about phone calls, it's about safety. It's about the security of knowing that in an emergency, help is just a phone call away. It's about accessing essential services, staying connected with loved ones, and having the dignity of knowing that rural Australians are valued as those in our cities. I am not willing to accept this complacency. I refuse to let Collinsville be left in the dark. This fight is far from over. I will be contacting the Minister for Communications again, and I will not stop until she finds the funding she so often speaks of. My constituents deserve better than vague promises, or worse yet, the suggestion that they simply switch to a different provider, as was the advice given by the Minister's office. To the people of Collinsville, I hear you and I am standing with you. I will continue fighting until we see the action you deserve.
The Assistant Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, Rural and Regional Health.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The doors are now open at the new Central Coast Veteran and Family Hub, located in the heart of our community at 31 Healy Street, Wyong. I was proud to join local RSL sub-branch members, RSL Lifecare and my friend New South Wales Minister for Veterans and Member for Wyong, David Harris, at the official opening last month. The hub will support the 8,000 Central Coast veterans and their families with improved access to specialist services closer to home, offering a range of tailored services to assist with transition, employment, social connection and advocacy services, along with important mental and physical health support and care. Recently, I joined the Veterans Walking Group from the hub through Wyong, led by Peter. The walk was followed by morning tea back at the hub, where veterans expressed the meaningful difference the hub is already making to them, their families and fellow veterans. A highlight was the dates gone versus planes gone bake-off between manager Kristen and Jamie, who currently holds the trophy spatula. Our government has delivered $1.7 million in funding through the Veteran Wellbeing Grants Program to establish the hub in Wyong. Thank you to the local RSL Lifecare team for the work that you're already doing for veterans in our community, and I look forward to continuing to work closely with you for our veterans and their families. Deputy Speaker, since I was elected 8 years ago, I've hosted seniors forums across my community to keep local seniors up to date with important local and national information. Over the last few months, I've held forums in Canwell, Wyoming, Long Jetty and Toukley. Locals at each forum have heard from representatives from Services Australia, My Aged Care and Seniors Rights Australia, providing up-to-date and relevant information to them and their families. And I've been able to update seniors on our government's work to help ease the cost of living for older Australians, including tax cuts for every taxpayer, energy bill relief and important changes in health services. Attendees have at every forum raised with me the real and significant difference that freezing the cost of PBS medicines and increasing accessibility to bulk billing local doctors has made for them and their families, so critical at that time of your life. Deputy Speaker, whether it's meaningful cost of living relief, repairing aged care, our Labor government is focused on delivering for local seniors in regional communities like mine on the Central Coast. And I'd like to personally thank the hundreds of local seniors who've joined my forums across the coast, and I'm delighted to continue to provide every one of them with our local seniors kits, which are still available from my office if seniors would like the most recent copy.
Call the member for Barara.
Deputy Speaker, the Barara electorate's home to around 20 different scouting groups, with boys and girls learning life skills and the value of contributing to their community. One of our fantastic local scouting groups is First Asquith. In recent years, Asquith's produced 3 Queen Scouts. I've also had the honour of awarding the Australian Scout Award to Thomas Berry of First Asquith. I've seen the positive impact that the Scouts can have, including the work of Will Berry, who organised a Cancer Council fundraiser through the local soccer club's Yellow Sock Day, and Caitlin Cleary, who during COVID organised a fundraiser for local healthcare workers and was named New South Wales Scout of the Year in 2020. The group's accolades are a testament to the work of people like David McFarlane, Mary Jo Eisen and David Patterson. At a recent visit to First Asquith, we talked about the group's plans to set up a rover crew, providing scouting opportunities for 18 to 26-year-olds. Another thing we talked about was the state of the facilities, which are shared with Pastors Peter and EJ Mabakwe and their congregation at the Awesome Rock Church, along with other community groups. The toilets and showers at the hall are run down and in urgent need of a repair. They were built in the 1980s and largely suited men. This doesn't represent the Scouts of 2024. I've been pleased to support Asquith Scouts the entire time I've been the member, and I'll be on their side to ensure they can continue to develop the next generation of leaders in our area. Deputy Speaker, the Hawkesbury River Dragons are a fantastic local sporting club in our community. The club's based at Brooklyn and started small in 2011, but since that time, membership has grown, with more than 40 members joining in the last 2 years alone. The club's successes have continued to grow too, with members competing right across Australia, recently placing 4th overall in the 2024 Region versus Region Regatta. Recently I got out on the water with the River Dragons at one of their regular training sessions and got a crash course on a sport which dates back 2,000 years. While there I heard from the President Steph Haig, Kavita Kaczynski and Helen Wood, along with River Dragons Beverly, Jane, Leanne, Ryan, V.O. Martin and so many others about their love of being on our beautiful Hawkesbury River. I also heard about the state of their current storage facilities. I saw the old shed where they store their equipment. It isn't what the club needs, as more and more people recognise the physical, mental and social wellbeing benefits of being part of an active group like the Hawkesbury River Dragons, and as that great club continues to grow. The Hawkesbury River Dragons presented me with an idea, a well thought out, modest but practical storage solution. So while I'm awaiting the River Dragons' call to lead them to success at their next competition, I think I'll be waiting a while for that call, I'll be working on a plan to support this great local club to get the facilities they need so that they can continue to bring our community together and bring that great competitive spirit that the 2,000-year-old sport of dragon boat racing has. As they tell me, life short, paddle hard.
Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you. And today I'd like to honour one of Eden Monero's quiet heroes, Mark Aliff, who died unexpectedly on the 22nd of August, aged only 54 years. Mark joined the RFS in his early teens as a junior under his father's captaincy, and he continued to volunteer throughout his life. Indeed, he was the captain of the Cobargo RFS during the Black Summer bushfires. Mark had immense knowledge and expertise, both of the local terrain and of all aspects of firefighting, which he not only shared with his own branch, but as an RFS trainer with brigades throughout Eden Monero. He not only served in the brigade, but helped train others in districts to get qualified. He devoted his life to helping others. Wherever there was a call for help, Mark was always there to assist without question. Mark will be remembered as brave, strong and determined. My sincere condolences to Mark's family and to the entire Cobargo community. I am a huge lover of country pubs, and one in Eda Monero just took out a top gong at the Australian Hotel Association's New South Wales 2024 Awards for Excellence. The Lake George Hotel in Bungendore was named winner of the Best Steak category. The Lake George was competing against top pubs from across the state, including in Sydney, and I'm so proud that the best pub steak can be found just down the road in Bungendore. A huge congratulations to the hotel's owners and staff. I look forward to getting in for a steak very soon. Motherland is Australia's first online rural mothers group program, and it held a special fundraiser over the weekend to celebrate Rural Women's Day and Perinatal Mental Health Week. Motherland was founded by Stephanie Trethui, who was this year's Tassie's Australian of the Year. The fundraiser was held at Motherland alumni and employee Kate Brow's Bib and Luke property on the Monero. A massive congratulations to the entire community for getting behind this fundraiser. Despite buying a ticket, I couldn't get there because I was unwell, but by all accounts it was a fantastic event where women could connect with other women from across the region while raising much needed funds to support rural mums right across Australia. I recently ran into a local celebrity and ultra-distance athlete, Dane Waits, who next month will cycle from Pambula to Batemans Bay, a distance of over 220 kilometres, including visiting local schools along the way. Dane's raising funds and awareness for Nardi House, specifically for therapy services to improve the quality of life of residents. Nardi House is in Quorma. It's the permanent home of 6 people with extremely high physical disabilities. This is on the back of Dane's run from Perth to Pambula, some 4,000 kilometres in 2017, where he raised money for Beyond Blue and Autism Spectrum Australia. Good luck, Dane. Thank you for your amazing work. We're all right behind you. And jump on Facebook and get onto Smile with Dane's Facebook site and donate.
Call the member for Forrest.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to celebrate the 14-year career of Kookaburra's captain Aaron Zalewski, who's announced his retirement from international hockey. Aaron grew up in Margaret River and developed his love of hockey playing with the Margaret River Hockey Club in the South West League. He debuted for the Kookaburras as a 19-year-old in a clash against India in Bunbury, very quickly cementing himself as a very competitive centre-half and midfielder. Aaron leaves the national team as one of their most decorated players of the modern era, winning 3 Commonwealth Games gold medals, 1 World Cup and the Champions Trophy twice. At Olympic level, he's represented Australia 3 times, winning a silver medal at the 2020 Tokyo Games. Outside of hockey, Aaron is a fierce advocate for the Southwest in its sports and ensures that regional athletes have access to sporting opportunities and facilities. He became a dad last year, so I'm sure he'll be looking forward to extra time with his family. But he's not stepping away from hockey altogether. He'll be representing the Kalinga Lancers in the India Hockey League starting in December. But I wanted to congratulate Aaron on a stellar career for the Kookaburras and proving once again that in Australia you are not limited by your postcode. But congratulations also to Harvey local Joe Comito, who's earned the title of Australia's top darts player, dominating the Australian Pro Tour. He will also represent Australia at the Paddy Power World Darts Championships in December in London. Best of luck to Joe. And also congratulations to Sophia Thomas, who recently won a karate gold medal at the World Shoto Cup in London. She's from Harvey. Over 350 competitors from 18 countries took part in the competition, and Sophia took home gold in the over-18s division. And again, you are not limited by your postcode in this country. Finally, and this is a different one, what a top job Cruiser did. The 6-year-old hard-working sheep wrangling kelpie from Yalyalup in my electorate, Cruiser was WA's finalist in the 2024 Cobber Challenge and finished 7th overall. Now, Cruiser shares a very special bond with his owner and trainer, as you would expect, and he works very, very hard. His owner and trainer is James Carr, and when you think that He had to run a total of 125.3 kilometres with speeds of up to 7.42 kilometres an hour. So this competition recognises the value and importance of working dogs in our regional and rural areas and farms. Congratulations to my wonderful achievers, and again, as I say in Australia, look what you can do.
Call the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. On the weekend, the Prime Minister and Minister Clare announced that a re-elected Albanese Labor government will cut student debt by 20% for every Australian carrying a HECS help debt. We'll also raise the threshold at which debt has to start being repaid, bring down minimum debt repayment levels and make fee-free TAFE permanent. These measures combined will slash $5,500 from the average level of student debt and put $680 a year back into the household budgets of university graduates and their families, including $8,500 across my electorate of Lyons. Bringing down student debt is part of Labor's broad suite of measures to tackle the cost of living pressures that we inherited from the Liberals 3 years ago. When Labor was elected, interest rates were on the rise and inflation was more than 6%. The budget was suffering from waste, rorts and incompetence. Our new Labor government took immediate steps to bring down the pressures that had built up under 10 years of Liberal mismanagement. Labor brought down 2 budget surpluses in 2 years when the Liberals achieved none in 10. Labor delivered tax cuts for every taxpayer, including bigger tax cuts for 9 in 10 Tasmanian workers, when the Liberals planned to give big tax cuts to high-income earners but no new tax cuts for low-income earners. Labor created 1 million new jobs, a record achieved by no other new government since Federation. Labor increased bulk billing across Australia when it was in freefall under the Liberals and created Medicare urgent care clinics opposed by the Liberals. I look forward to one opening my electorate imminently. Labor slashed the cost of medicines on the PBS and introduced 60-day scripts opposed by the Liberals. Labor provided energy bill rebates opposed by the Liberals. Labor made childcare cheaper opposed by the Liberals. Labor introduced fee-free TAFE courses for skills in critical short supply opposed by the Liberals. And Labor introduced a $10 billion plan to address the nation's critical shortage of housing supply opposed by the Liberals and inexplicably opposed by the Greens. Key elements of Labor's housing supply plan still remain stuck in the Senate, condemning tens of thousands of Australians to homelessness while the Liberals and the Greens play politics. Every time Labor has tried to fix the mess left behind by 10 years of Liberal neglect, the Liberals have opposed us. Every time Labor has tried to make life just that little bit easier for Australians struggling with the cost of living pressures that are affecting countries worldwide, the Liberals have opposed us. And now, predictably, the Liberals are opposing our plans to reduce student debt. We will get on with the job of fixing the mess the Liberals left behind. We will get on with the job of building Australia's future.
I call the member for Riverina.
As I drive to work in Canberra, I noticed some months ago on the intersection at Manuka Circuit, which intersects with Canberra Avenue going into Captain Cook Crescent. It's wonder they haven't changed the name of Captain Cook Crescent. They probably will, knowing we are in Canberra. But there was a crash many months ago, and the windscreen was all over the road, and it's still there. And I say that in the context that this is the national capital, and this debris has been there for many months. You know, that wouldn't happen in a country town, certainly not a country town in my electorate. And I say that in the context that Parks last weekend won the Tidy Towns overall Tidy Towns Award for 2024. And well done to Parks. And I well remember driving through Temora a year or so ago, and there was a piece of paper in the main street, and I very rare, because it's such a tidy town, that I thought I must send a text to when I pull up to the Mayor, Rick Furman, and say, hey mate, you've got a bit of rubbish in your main street. But when I travelled back there, it was gone. It was Saturday afternoon, it was gone. Just a few hours later, because they take care of their town. They love their town. They take pride in their lawns. That is country communities. That is regional Australia. That is the real heart of this nation. And we've got so many volunteers, so many good people in the regions. And I've attended 3 events, one in what will hopefully be the new part of my electorate, Murray Bateman, and as well as Harden and Illabo in recent times. And the number of hard-working, dedicated people who get behind these communities. At the Murray Bateman Field Days, the President Ian McCall, Vice President Steph Helm, Treasurer Jenny Weeks head up a dedicated committee that has held these field days for many, many years. And it was such a good event. Thousands of people descending upon that little community, and such a good day. Promoting agriculture, promoting country living. The Harden Kite Festival, it draws on assistance from more than 50 to up to 100 volunteers working with the dedicated committee there, and gee, they do some good work. And of course we were aided and abetted by Windy Day on the Harden Racecourse, and the colour and vibrance of that day. If you haven't been there, make sure you put it on your bucket list. And of course then the 102nd Illabo Show, presided over by Simon Muller, Secretary Nicole Hopkins, Treasurer Gerard Ryan. The new amenities that were put in place by the Coalition Government during COVID, something to be seen. And well done to indeed the Illabo Show and all the shows, because they are what country communities are all about. And may long live those agricultural shows, because they do so much good and promote so much benefit of our local regions.
Call the member for McEwen.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. And of course, we know Australia's best agricultural show is the Whittlesea Show. 165 years of continuous show. This marvellous event is recognised as one of the most popular agricultural shows in the state. It's great to watch the community come together, catch up with old friends across the region, and also thank residents and organisations for their continued support for what the Labor government is doing for us and our community. Whittlesea Show has it all: wood chopping, carnival rides, trade exhibitions, livestock, animal competitions, little kids riding motorbikes with their helmets look bigger than the motorbike itself, but they're out there having a ball in the Grand Parade and just having fun, as well as all the local cuisine and all the other things that are there, like crafts, photography, you name it, it's there, and everyone is just having a great time. Congratulations to the Whittlesea Agricultural Society for another fantastic showing, and thank you to everyone who stopped by our tent to have a chat. Sadly, on the Saturday night, there was some terrible winds came through and knocked down quite a few of the marquees, and it meant a lot of the exhibitors lost all their product, and one gin distiller lost every single bottle that was on there as his marquee blew over. But what happened Sunday morning? Everyone out there helping and trying to put it all back together to make sure that it stayed on, and it was just a great fun. On the Sunday, I spent the day with the Lions doing tickets and having a ball, and it was just a fantastic event. Also, Deputy Speaker, on the 26th of October, it was my utmost pleasure to attend the 30th anniversary of UGFM. UGFM is Upper Goulburn Radio, and it's graced our local airways, providing essential information to keep communities safe in times of emergency and uncertainty. A beacon of local news that you can trust, particularly in times when our community is suffering the most, through the Black Saturday bushfires, through the floods and the wind damage. They're always there with accurate, on-time, real information. It also keeps us updated with festivities and events and local news, demonstrating why community radio is so important in rural and regional areas. And it's a testament to why we need to keep them on air. Peter Weeks, one of the presenters that I have been with for over 12 years now, every fortnight having our chat, also got inducted into the Community Broadcasting Association Australia's Honour Roll, which is a fantastic achievement. And I wish them well for another 30 years, but it's an institution that we rely on very much because of the importance it plays. Lastly, this Sunday, my wife Lisa and I will join Mike Garrett and members of the Romsey-Lancefield RSL to unveil 2 plaques on the Avenue of Honour between Romsey and Lancefield. These plaques will join the plaques that I secured $8,000 funding for to help. This one this year that we are launching is the Tobruk campaign plaque, because it's important to both of us that we did this, because both of our grandfathers served at Tobruk as rats. And it's been a great honour to work with the Rotary Club to get this done. We'll have our one done and the other one done, which will be the Malayan campaign, which was supported by members of the Romsey-Lancefield Rotary Club.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded, and I call the clerk.
Order of the day number 1, Migration Amendment, Strengthening Sponsorship and Nomination Processes Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise to talk about a bill around migration, one of the most important parts of our community and our society. As many of us know and talk about, the three key pillars of our Australian story and our Australian society is our Indigenous culture, our British heritage and our democracy, and also our migrant story. Like many Australians, my family came to Australia in the 50s, 1953, and they settled in Sylvan, which is in the electorate of Casey, established a farm, and as a third-generation local, that farm and that establishment, that community, has been a key to my journey here today. And many of us have a migrant story, and I'll talk a little bit about the importance of making sure we get that right in a minute. But how we get our migrant balance right is so important from an economic perspective. It is crucial to fix the skills shortages that we face as a nation, exacerbated no doubt by COVID and the need to close the borders. It plays an important role in productivity. As we know, productivity is down over 6% in the last 2.5 years. The RBA monetary statement yesterday showed that they are now forecasting further productivity drops in the next 12 months, as getting skilled migration right can be a key pillar in driving productivity and also plays a crucial role in economic growth. So how we get the details of this legislation right is important. But there's also a really important element to this bill when it comes to social licence and making sure that the Australian people continue to support our migration program as we move forward. Every Member of Parliament has the amazing opportunity to attend citizenship ceremonies in their electorate, to welcome new Australians. It is one of the most enjoyable parts of our roles as Members of Parliament, welcoming those new Australians as they celebrate becoming Australian citizens, many coming from different journeys, skilled migrants, refugees, family reunions, many stories, but the joy on their face when they become new Australians is one of the highlights for all of us, no doubt. And when I get the opportunity to talk and share my story with our new citizens, I talk about those three pillars of Australia. We're very lucky in the Shire of Yarra Ranges to always have an amazing welcome to country from Julie Coombs. Julie does a fantastic job, and the Indigenous story is an important part of our local community. Healesville has a strong Indigenous community through Corrandirk, which was an establishment over 100 years ago recognising the Indigenous people in Victoria and in Healesville. So Julie gives a beautiful welcome to country to make sure we acknowledge that pillar of our society. We as elected officials are there through the democratically elected process, recognising our British traditions, the importance of democracy and the role that we play. And that third element is that migration story. As we all know, over half of Australians have at least one parent born overseas, and those three pillars are so crucial. And when I talk to the new Australians and I welcome them and share my family's story about how anything is possible, I describe those three pillars as a rope, as the Australian rope. And the reason, Deputy Speaker, I describe it as a rope is because the three individual strands by themselves have a level of strength. But when you bind those three strands together, that strength multiplies significantly. And that is what we need to continue to do as an Australian community and in this House. And getting legislation like this right, so we're bringing skilled migrants into the country to make a difference, is an important part of keeping that strength together as a country. So when I look at this bill and I look at the impacts for my community, there are three specific areas that impact directly the community of Casey that I want to talk about. Those being hospitality, farming, and also construction. As we know, there is a shortage of skilled workers in our country when it comes to construction. Housing prices have increased significantly, and those skills shortages are exacerbating that. So we need to continue to get that balance right and make sure we bring more tradies in to do the work. My electorate, the electorate of Casey, is the #1 electorate in the country when it comes to trades as a percentage of workforce. So we know how important trades are to our community. But every tradie that I talk to know that the biggest challenge they have is trying to get new apprentices in, but also finding workers to work with them. And it's crucial that we understand having skilled migrants coming in is not replacing Australian jobs. It's allowing the small business owners in my electorate to create more opportunities, more jobs to work together. The second area that is very relevant to my community of Casey is the beautiful Yarra Valley. Now, the Yarra Valley is known for its farming, but also its hospitality. And I have spoken to many hospitality venues about the concerns they have about not being able to get access to the workers they need. And one of the particular skills that we need to allow for through all our migration policies and our skilled policies is allowing for the specialisation around authentic cuisines. And I have a wonderful restaurant chain, 2 stores in Warburton and Belgrave called Babaji's. And Billy and the team there do authentic South Indian cuisine. Very unique, very different to what you would get at many other Indian restaurants. And Billy and her team need to bring in specialised workers from the south of India to make sure that the food they create is authentic. And again, this is not taking jobs from Australians, it's creating more jobs. It allows her team to create that authentic product, create jobs for waiters, for cleaners, for staff within the venue, buy food and produce from our local farmers as well. So we need to have some flexibility within this list to understand that regions have different concerns, but also a catch-all around chefs does not necessarily capture the uniqueness of our culture, the uniqueness of different countries creating authentic food in tribute to their region, but also creating more opportunities within the local area. And I know for many of our farmers, getting access to workers is crucial as well. So we need to look at how the skilled occupation list will cater for different employment needs across regions. The needs of my electorate of Casey are different to many needs in the inner city and other areas. We need to have that included, and we always need to avoid a top-down approach. A localised approach will deliver the best outcomes for areas. Whether it's farming, whether it's hospitality, whether it's construction, they are the concerns of my community. We need to know how Jobs and Skills Australia will function to allow for those regional differences, because as I said, what we're concerned about is different to an area in the inner city, as an example. And creating the flexibility within the system will become crucial as well, because the shortage we have today will not be the shortage we have in 6 months or 12 months, particularly when we look at technology and we look at the speed in which technology is moving, whether it's AI, whether it's quantum, whether it's the AUKUS agreement and Pillar 2, the importance of that technology. How are we going to ensure that Skills and Jobs Australia, this legislation, these rules will be dynamic and will be able to be adjusted as new opportunities come? Because when you're dealing with the tech sector, you're dealing with trends and opportunities that can develop almost overnight. And we need the ability to bring talent in as a startup looks to scale, to bring software engineers in so they can go from a startup Series A to a Series B, Series C, hopefully become the next Canva, the next Afterpay of Australia, billion-dollar companies, global companies. Having that flexibility is important. And we need to continue to look to those differences around technologies, around regional areas, around farms and construction in particular, given the shortage. So it's an important step that we're making, but I hope we can always look to have that flexibility for the needs of local areas and unique technologies. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. And I call the Assistant Minister.
Thanks, Speaker. I table an addendum to the explanatory memorandum. I want to thank all of those members of Parliament who contributed to this debate. This bill implements a commitment made by the government through the migration strategy to introduce a new temporary skilled worker visa, the Skills in Demand visa. The bill will legislate the income thresholds and index those thresholds for the specialist skills, core skills and the proposed essential skills streams for the Skills in Demand visa, which is replacing the temporary skills shortage visa. Speaker, the protection of Australian workers and their jobs and incomes is paramount for this government, and that's why this bill legislates minimum income thresholds that will ensure that persons nominated to work in Australia are less likely to be displacing an Australian worker and will be less vulnerable to exploitation by ensuring that they receive fair remuneration. Legislated income thresholds will also ensure that persons nominated to work in Australia have adequate wages to support themselves and their families. Indexation of these wages ensures parity between migrants and Australian workers, and over time migrants are not paid less than Australian workers where they're performing the same role. The bill also provides protections and oversight mechanisms through the establishment of a public register of approved sponsors. The register includes the name of the approved sponsor, their business postcode, the number of sponsored workers and their occupations. This will help temporary skilled migrant workers find a new sponsor and provide a resource to check that a sponsoring employer is legitimate. The bill provides for annual indexation of the income thresholds for the specialist skills and core skills streams. This ensures that persons nominated for these streams have adequate wages to support themselves and their families whilst they're in Australia. Indexation of these wages ensures parity between migrants and Australian workers so that migrants will not be paid less than Australian workers where they are performing the same role. Proposed annual indexation of the income thresholds for the essential skills stream will be determined in each agreement or in accordance with the requirements of the prescribed in the amendment to the migration regulations. Speaker, based on the feedback of businesses, the bill amends the Migration Act to provide that labour market testing will be completed within 6 months, and we're increasing that from 4 months, prior to the sponsor of a skilled migrant worker lodging a nomination. This change complements the removal of the requirement for employers to advertise positions exclusively through Workforce Australia that we made in December 2023. The bill provides protections and oversight mechanisms through the establishment of a public register of approved sponsors. The development of a public register is important in ensuring transparency and accountability. Temporary migrant workers make a valuable contribution not only to Australia's prosperity, fulfilling much-needed labour and skill shortages, but also to our communities, our national identity and our connections across the world. This bill will ensure that persons nominated to work in Australia are less likely to be displacing an Australian worker and less vulnerable to exploitation. It also ensures that persons nominated have adequate wages to support themselves and their families in Australia. The bill delivers on the government's commitment to introduce a new temporary skilled worker visa to address critical skill shortages and to better align the immigration system to the country's workforce needs. The bill is another important milestone in the government's reform agenda in migration policy, and I commend the bill to the chamber.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I'll put the question. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against, no. I think the ayes have it, and I call the clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to amend the Migration Act 1958 and for related purposes.
The Federation Chamber will now consider the bill in detail. I understand it's the wish of the Federation Chamber to take the bill as a whole, and the question is that the bill be agreed to. I call the member for Wentworth.
I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move amendments 1 to 3 as circulated in my name together.
Is leave granted?
Leave granted.
I move amendments 1 to 3 as circulated in my name together. Deputy Speaker, whether a migrant works in construction or computing, we want to welcome the best and brightest to our shores. The new specialist skills visa pathway is supposed to enable this by granting a fast-track visa for those earning more than $135,000. But the government, for some reason, has decided to exclude trade workers, machinery operators, drivers and labourers from this new visa pathway. There has been no clear rationale articulated for this decision, aside from an outdated distinction between so-called blue-collar and white-collar workers. The decision to exclude construction workers comes at a time when we urgently need to build more houses and when we urgently need to expand the construction workforce. So, Deputy Speaker, while I support this bill, I do not believe that the carve-out for skilled trade workers is justified. And more broadly, I do not want to see politics and political pressure being involved in decisions about our migration system. I don't think it is appropriate more broadly that the politicians or the government of the day get to choose who is excluded or who isn't excluded in these pathways, because I think the point of the specialist skill pathway visa, this point of having this threshold of $135,000 in income, is to say that when the industry knows what they need, these people should be let in, not that government of the day should once again be pulling the strings based on any political pressures that they might be under. So I believe that this carve-out needs to be removed, or an alternative solution needs to be brought forward quickly to bring in high-skilled trade workers to Australia. My amendment would remove the carve-out by preventing the Minister from specifying whether particular occupations are eligible or ineligible for this new visa pathway. I acknowledge that this amendment is not a panacea that will end Australia's shortages of skilled tradies overnight, but it would make a positive difference to the building sector. It is aligned with the government's migration strategy, and it will help ensure our skilled migration program is fit for the future. I want to acknowledge the constructive engagement I've had with the Minister for Home Affairs on this issue over several months, and acknowledge our shared desire to address skills shortages in construction. I urge the government and the opposition to support this amendment, because I do believe the Australian people do not want to see politics and political in considerations on issues in relation to getting the best and brightest into the country. But I would ask then the Minister two questions. Firstly, if the government is not willing to support this amendment, can you please give me an explanation as to why? And secondly, will you at least commit to providing an alternative pathway for bringing more skilled tradies to Australia? For example, by ensuring that all relevant occupations are included on the priority list for the new core skills pathway. Thank you.
Call the Assistant Minister.
Thanks, Speaker. I thank the member for Wentworth for her constructive consultations with the Minister. Unfortunately, we can't support this amendment. The amendment that the member seeks to move would allow skilled trades to access the specialist skills pathway, and there's a distinction. There is a specialist skills pathway as part of this visa and a core skills pathway. Those that are working in the trades will be in the core skills pathway. The reason for that distinction is that the Parkinson Review recommended that there be the establishment of a high income, highly skilled specialist pathway for skilled migration. And in relation to that, the review stated specifically that, I quote, "It is our expectation that this group be limited to professional occupations and not generally include the skilled trades." So the government has accepted that recommendation, and this bill reflects the government adopting that approach. Skilled trades will still, however, be eligible for the core skills pathway if their occupation is included on the core skills occupation list. And Jobs and Skills Australia have undertaken a thorough consultation regarding that core skills occupation list. They've consulted with businesses, unions, industry associations, the state and territory governments and other stakeholders. They've made a recommendation to the Minister for Home Affairs, and the Minister is finalising that process and will publish that list soon. But I would say that this government is committed to ensuring that we support employers who do have requirements for skilled labour in the trades area, particularly in the construction trades. And it was reported in estimates this week that 11,349 skilled building workers have migrated to Australia over financial year 23-24. That's the highest number of skilled building workers in 10 years in Australia, and double the number that came to Australia under the final year of the coalition government. So we are responding to the needs of employers when it comes to ensuring that we're processing visas for skilled trades workers as quickly as possible to ensure that the construction sector can continue to grow in Australia.
Have a further conversation.
The member for Wentworth.
I'd like to address some further questions to the minister. We know we are in a construction. I don't need jobs and skills to come back to me or anyone, frankly, in this parliament to know that we are absolutely in a construction in a hole in relation to construction skills in this country. It is absolutely evident, when you talk to any builder, it is evident when you see that there is a cost blowout in that the government infrastructure spending of $30 billion, over $120 billion. We, as a country, are paying over the odds on construction at the moment and unable to build housing because of lack of skills. So I'm really still cannot understand why the government hasn't made a commitment, at least on the core skills pathway, to include all the construction workers, because we know we need them. We need them now. What is firstly, what is the rationale for not doing this? And secondly, what is the time frame that the minister is going to undertake is considering this? Because the need is desperately evident, and it just doesn't make sense to me, honestly.
Well, the government certainly recognises that there are challenges in the construction industry associated with increasing costs. Much of that is to do with supply chain issues on the back of COVID. Some of it is to do with increasing labour costs. But this government is committed to ensuring, firstly, as a foundation, that we are training more Australian tradespeople. And that is the philosophy behind the government announcing this week that fee-free TAFE will be permanent, so that anyone that wants to do a trade in the construction area gets access to doing that trade, and that we're training more Australians. So that's the foundation. But where there is a requirement for additional labour, the government is putting in place a migration system that will allow employers to bring in skilled tradespeople in the construction sector as quickly as possible to supplement that labour. And I again reiterate that this government has brought in more skilled building workers in the last year than any time over the last 10 years. So the government is responding to the needs of industry and that increasing demand. Secondly, we're of course ensuring that we're making sure that we've got the housing policies in place that build more houses and increase housing supply. So all of those policies associated with increasing investments in social and affordable housing, the Housing Australia Future Fund, Help to Buy, which is held up in the Senate, are all aimed at ensuring that we're increasing the housing supply and more Australians get access to owning their own home.
Member for Wentworth.
Yeah, I'll just come back to the question, which is what's the time frame under which the government is going to come back in relation to the core skills pathway, and what is the commitment in relation to ensuring that construction workers are on that list, because those are, I appreciate what you're saying about TAFE and skills, but you talk to businesses right now and you talk to people right now, if there's any chance of meeting any of the housing targets, that is what you need. You need construction workers now.
There are construction workers being approved now. They are being approved. In terms of the timeline regarding the Jobs and Skills Australia draft and the core skills occupation list, as I said, that's with the minister at the moment, and the minister is currently finalising that, and that will be released over the coming months.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I'll put the question. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against, no. I think the noes have it. As the question is unresolved, in accordance with Standing Order 188, the question will be included in the Federation Chamber's report to the House on the bill.
I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move amendments 1 and 2 as circulated in my name together.
Is leave granted?
Leave's granted.
Leave is granted.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And can I just say in the first instance, it's good to see that we are having this debate. This is something that the Leader of the Opposition put on the national agenda in his budget in reply speech in May, and it's very good to see that there is a realisation that we have to do something about the shortage of workers that we have in the construction space. Now, what we would like to see is that the government address carpenters and joiners, electricians, plumbers, bricklayers and stonemasons, building inspectors, construction managers, painters and decorators, plasterers, roof tilers, wall and floor tilers. Because if we are to deal with the construction crisis we've got at the moment, then we have to make sure that we can complement our domestic workforce. Now, one of the things, and we've been pointing this out for a very long time, that the government has made an absolute botch of is its migration program. Over 1 million people have come into this country in the last 2 years, and we do not have the houses to be able to support that level of population increase. And one of the things which is absolutely clear, is that those numbers are going to continue, because every time the government has a net overseas migration target, it misses it, and it misses it by tens of thousands of people, and it's going to continue to do so. And while they continue to miss their net overseas migration targets, they're not building the houses that we need, and this is causing a housing crisis and it's causing a rental crisis, and the government needs to address this. And now, sure, we are all absolutely in favour in making sure that we've got more people locally doing the trades that we need, but we've also got to make sure that during this housing crisis, during this rental crisis, that we are complementing our domestic industry with the skills that they need. Now, we know why that this isn't being done at the moment, and that's because of the CFMEU. But we also know now that the CFMEU has been put into administration. So the government can work now to make sure that we are complementing the workforce skills that we need in the construction space. Now, the Assistant Minister has talked about a core skills pathway and said that these things should go on the core skills pathway. Well, what I would say to the Minister, and I would ask the Minister this question, at a minimum, why don't construction managers and building inspectors go onto this list? Because they should be on this list. Construction managers and building inspectors, at a minimum, should go onto this list. And I would say to the Minister, why are they being excluded? Now, our view is, as I've made very clear in my amendment, that what we should be doing is putting trade workers, machinery operators or drivers and labourers, because given the crisis that we have at the moment, which is so great, and especially when it seems that this government is not going to be able to bring net overseas migration under control, that 1 million is going to head to 1.5 million rapidly, then something needs to be done, and it needs to be done urgently. So that's why we need trade workers, we need machinery operators and drivers and labourers to be able to complement our existing domestic construction workforce. And at a minimum, if we're going to go back and say, well, the review said this and the review said that, then I would say to the Assistant Minister, why aren't construction managers and building inspectors at a minimum on that list? Because the whole process that the government has embarked upon, and I give the Assistant Minister a leave pass because he's part of the new ministers that have come in to try and clean up the mess of the previous ministers, but we need this mess cleaned up quickly. So, Minister, why won't you agree to our amendments, given what is happening, and why in particular won't construction managers and building inspectors be put on the list?
The Assistant Minister for Immigration.
I thank the Shadow Minister for his contribution. The government won't be supporting the amendments that he's moved. There's a simple reason why we have a housing shortage in Australia, and that's because the previous government didn't invest in constructing new social and affordable housing in Australia. There was no investment in additional housing supply under the previous government, and this government is having to clean up that mess through policies such as the Housing Australia Future Fund, Help to Buy and others. And it's working because this coming 12 months, 13,500 new social and affordable houses will be constructed under this government's Housing Australia Future Fund allocation. As to the core occupation list, I reiterate the point I made earlier, that the core occupation list, as recommended by Jobs and Skills Australia, has been put together after a thorough process of consultation between businesses in particular, unions, workers, state and territory governments and employer associations and industry associations. And the list responds to the needs of industry. The list responds to the needs of industry. And again, that is what the government is doing, because we have brought in close to 11,500 skilled building workers over the last 12 months, which is more than was brought in under the coalition in its final year. In fact, it's double the numbers under the coalition in its final year. So we're responding to the needs of industry. We're ensuring that we're bringing on that additional supply in the housing market. And this bill, with its specialist skills pathway for those who are working at trades level and above, and its core skills pathway for trades occupations, ensures that we get the right labour that we need in Australia to meet those demands into the future.
Thank you. The member for Wannon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And I say to the Assistant Minister, over 1 million people in 2 years have come into the country and we've got a housing crisis and a rental crisis. Now, the government is using this figure that 11,000 people have been brought in to help deal with the skills needed for the construction industry and especially the housing industry. Does the Minister think, as we're now heading to nearly 1.5 million people coming in over 3 years, that 11,000 is enough? Or does the Minister think that we need to make sure that we've got additional skilled people to help with this housing crisis and rental crisis, and therefore we have to find additional pathways to be able to bring in the construction skills that we need? And that is why we need to do something urgently to address this issue, because otherwise the Minister is saying 1.5 million people coming in this country, which is a record number. We've never seen the like of this. That 11,000 additional skills in this area is enough. Is that what he's saying, or do we need more?
The Assistant Minister for Immigration.
Well, as the Shadow Minister is aware, there are a certain allocation of a number of visas in different categories that are outlined by the government each year. The overwhelming majority is allocated to skilled migration to ensure that employers have the skills that they need to meet the demands of industry in Australia. Now, I mentioned earlier that our focus in terms of providing that labour is to train more Australians. That's the priority for this government, to train more Australians in traineeships and apprenticeships, particularly in the construction trades, which is why we're making fee-free TAFE permanent. But where there's a need for additional labour and demand for additional labour, there are opportunities for employers and the states and territories to sponsor skilled workers. And the numbers that are allocated in that program are based on demand. So it's up to an employer to make an application to the department to sponsor a skilled worker, or indeed a state or territory government. And the federal government responds to that application, assuming that the person meets all of the relevant criteria, by granting a visa. So the list is compiled based on the demands of industry and meeting the demands of industry, and that will continue into the future.
The member for
Question, Deputy Speaker. I asked the Assistant Minister whether he thinks that the government's very ambitious, some would say highly fanciful, housing target can be met given the existing construction workforce in this country at the moment. Is it possible for the government to achieve its target for housing in this country over the next 5 years, which is seen by most people as likely to fall between 400,000 to 500,000 short? Is the existing workforce going to be able to meet the government's target? Because everyone in the industry says that it won't be able to. So how are you going to complement the domestic workforce to cover that 400 to 500,000 likely shortfall in your housing target?
the Assistant Minister.
Well, the first thing that we're doing, Speaker, is building more homes, which is what Australians want and need. Under the previous government, investment in social and affordable housing stalled, and coupled with a number of state Liberal governments, they're actually selling off public and affordable housing. So this government is committed to firstly ensuring that we're increasing the housing supply through policies such as the Housing Australia Future Fund, through our social housing accelerator, through the co-investments with the state and territory governments in building more social and affordable housing. We've also got schemes that ensure that we're assisting renters with the cost of rents increasing as well. But at the same time, we're investing in skills development of Australians to meet that future demand through policies such as free fee TAFE, but we're also ensuring that where there's a requirement for employers for additional labour, that they get access to that labour, that skilled labour, particularly in the building trades, as quickly as possible. And it's reflected in the figures. It's reflected in the fact that we've had a doubling of the number of skilled trade workers for approved skilled visas over the last 12 months compared to the final year of the coalition. It's the highest that it's been in the last 10 years. So the claim that the government is not responding to the demands of industry is a fallacy. We've doubled the numbers and we're putting in place a new system that will ensure it's more responsive to the needs of employers, particularly in the construction trades.
Thank you. The question is that the amendments be agreed to, and I put the question. All in favour say aye. Against no? No. I think the noes have it. Sorry. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. And I call the clerk.
Order of the day number 2, Privacy and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2024, consideration in detail.
The Federation Chamber will now consider the bill in detail. I understand it is the wish of the Federation Chamber to take the bill as a whole. The question is that the bill be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In today's digital world, privacy is becoming an increasingly precious commodity. With so much of our lives shared online, Australians are rightly concerned about how to safeguard their personal information. A recent survey shows that 89% of people want stronger laws to protect their personal information. Although concerningly, only 32% of Australians feel they have control over their own data. That is telling. Our current Privacy Act is outdated and does not account for the complexities of the internet, smartphones or digital identities we all have. The massive amounts of data we generate come with risks and make us particularly vulnerable to scams or exploitation. In fact, 74% of Australians feel data breaches are one of the biggest privacy risks they face today. It's clear that we must strengthen our privacy laws so that Australians can confidently navigate the digital landscape without fear of losing control of their most personal information. As I mentioned in this place only a few weeks ago, scams are rising and causing a lot of heartache to so many in our community, including in Warringah, and it impacts people of all ages. We have to be clear about that. 96% of Australians were exposed to scams in the 5 years up to 2021 alone, and that is increasing in the last few years. In 2023, we lost some $2.74 billion to scammers, and that is more than $5,200 per minute, and much of it is online. We need strong, robust and up-to-date privacy laws that the public can trust and that can be a key part of our economic success. It means government and companies of all stripes must invest in the appropriate measures to keep people's information and data safe. Too often we hear of data breaches that are impacting a huge amount of Australians. We've seen so many of those incidents in recent years. Think to the hacks of Medibank and Optus, trusted brands, but there you go, data taken, where people's personal information was hacked and used for malicious purposes. So, almost 4 years since the Privacy Act review commenced, we now have the first stage of reform before the House that many feel does not quite hit the mark and address how many feel about privacy in Australia in 2024. The bill does finally introduce a statutory tort for serious invasion of privacy, and that has been anticipated for more than a decade. So it's good to finally be there. It will allow Australians to sue for damages for serious invasions of privacy. This is either an intrusion into seclusion, for example, being filmed in a private place, or misuse of information relating to a person where they had a reasonable expectation of privacy. So I think it's important to emphasise the threshold has been put at serious invasions of privacy. So the law will only apply if that invasion is considered serious, it meets that threshold, and it's committed intentionally or recklessly. Serious harms caused by an organisation's negligence would not be enough. So, which is concerning because they are certainly the most high-profile and and data breaches that have impacted the highest number of people. The bill also includes an anti-doxing offence with prison sentences of up to 7 years. It's in part a response to an incident earlier this year when the personal details of hundreds of Jewish members of an online support group were published without their consent, leading to great concerns by so many in the community. It also provides a process for a potential children's privacy code and a tiered penalties that provide lower fines for more minor breaches of the Act. It is good to see this bill not place any further compliance obligations on small businesses. We know that is a difficulty. And whilst we want everyone's privacy and information protected, it falls to larger companies and corporations to do much of the heavy lifting in this area, particularly the social media companies and platforms. Small businesses are already under immense pressure and have faced a plethora of new laws and compliance obligations in the last few years. And so whilst many are still struggling from the effects of the pandemic and subsequent cost of living crisis, the exemption in the Privacy Act for entities with less than 3 million annual turnover ensures a degree of nuance between small and medium enterprises and larger ones that have the resources to fulfil the compliance obligations of the Act. Nevertheless, it is a high-stakes roadmap, and noting the time, I will seek an extension from the Chair.
The member has the call.
Thank you. However, there are some shortcomings in this bill to modernise our privacy laws. The most significant, impactful proposals to reform Privacy Act, long flagged as its policy intent by the government and expected by the industry, have all been left out of the bill. So I do have questions for the Attorney-General of why that has happened, with the suggestion being that they will be in a second tranche bill sometime after the next election. Unfortunately, that doesn't give much confidence when people are concerned about those elements being missing in this legislation. The bill as it stands will not address any of the systemic problems with toxic social media, intrusive data brokering, online tracking, profiling and targeting, or the algorithms which push hate speech, misinformation and other harmful content. However, there are two potential changes that could be made to this bill now that the government already says it plans to make, dealing with foundational matters. And I would urge the Attorney-General to consider these changes to do to the bill now to make sure we have those additional protections. As such, the two suggested amendments would go a long way to tackling the excessive practices of larger companies, such as recent news about Meta scrapping all its Australian users' data to scraping all of its Australian users' data to train its AI, which they don't do to Facebook users in Europe because the EU's definition of consent in the equivalent law is stronger. So Australians have been left are less protected than Facebook users in Europe because of that definition. And so that is something I urge the Attorney-General to turn his mind to and to consider in this legislation now rather than delaying. The change includes to clarify and update the definition of personal information to ensure that modern digital practices are within the scope of the regulation, and to clarify and update the definition of consent to reflect community expectations that individual consumers should not be tricked into online and offline surveillance activities without their active choice and consent. So I urge the government to consider such amendments, as they will enhance this bill as it stands now and go some way to assure Australians that we in this place and the government are making changes that are up to date in a very rapidly changing digital world. I would also ask the government to consider amending the laws of contempt as part of its wider privacy reform considerations, specifically with the way court materials are and have been leaked to the media in recent instances, in particular in the case of the proceedings relating to incidents in this place, and such as the Lehman civil trial that concluded earlier this year. It's clear that material reached the media that was obtained under court order, but there was no repercussions for this breach. And the difficulty is our privacy laws allows exceptions for news and media, which is appropriate in a democracy. We want free media. But with that freedom comes responsibilities for it to be used in accordance with the law, in accordance with the rules, especially our rules in court, and with due care and responsibility. And I feel that that has been lacking. That line has been blurring for some time, and it's time for there to be some regulatory catch-up to ensure all in our public discourse deal with information sensitively and appropriately, especially when it involves private material that is then used in the media inappropriately. It's an issue I intend to continue looking at, in particular through legislative amendments. So I will support the bill. I welcome increasing and amending, bringing the Privacy Act up to date and increasing those protections, but again, urge the government to be bolder, more quickly look at what outside experts are proposing and asking for, and consider these two specific amendments in relation to definition of consent and private information to ensure this current tranche of reform meets the desired intent of providing greater protection for privacy for Australians online. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that the bill be agreed to, and I call the Attorney-General.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I welcome the support of the member for Warringah for the bill, and just in relation to the questions that she's asked in respect of possible amendments, particularly the updating of the wording in the definition of personal information and consent. As I've made clear in introducing this bill, this is the first stage of the government's commitment to amending the Privacy Act, overall with the intent of providing individuals with greater control over their personal information. The particular matters that the member for Warringah has mentioned, that is the definitions of personal information and consent, were matters that were considered as part of the broad Privacy Act review that was undertaken by the Attorney-General's Department, and that we have published both the review and the government's response to that review earlier this year. the government has agreed in principle that the definitions of both of those terms should be updated, and I want to make it clear that we intend to continue to advance the proposals that we have agreed in principle to progress in our response to the Privacy Act review. We are continuing with targeted consultation with stakeholders on draft provisions. It's very important to ensure that amended definitions, which are obviously foundational to the operation of the Privacy Act, are drafted carefully so that they're fit for purpose and workable in a diverse range of contexts. At this point in the process, the government doesn't support amending the definitions as currently proposed.
Thank you. The member for McNamara.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. I wanted to start by reading some words published in the Jewish Independent from the wonderful Lee Kaufman, a Jewish writer in my community. The covert and overt anti-Semitism my Jewish peers and I began experiencing, I had to do something. Otherwise, I'd feared I'd sink into depression. This led to the establishment of the WhatsApp group for mutual support and self-preservation. Lee started a WhatsApp group with Jewish artists so they could support one another and have a safe space to grieve. 600 members of the community joined because they too needed a space to share. And in January this year, the names and details of members of this WhatsApp group were published online. Photos of Jewish artists with the caption genocidal, workplaces of Jewish businesses owners were boycotted, Jewish artists were declined job opportunities, their children were threatened, some people even moved homes. What we saw happening to the Jewish community was more than a trend. It wasn't just hurtful, it was dangerous. It had real consequences. But to me, what was just as concerning was how people were responding to the stories about doxing. People said they deserved it. And as Lee said in her article, many Australian Jewish artists and academics are still living the doxing consequences. But new anti-doxing legislation was just introduced for debate in federal parliament, of which we are debating today, following what happened to us. So perhaps our adversity will benefit Australian society at large. That's why I'm pleased to speak on this bill, and even more pleased to speak and support this bill because it will protect every single Australian online. What happened to members of my community is unacceptable, but the sad reality of the online world is that it was not an isolated incident. The digital world is changing and becoming more dangerous. The threats and dangers are evolving. The Australian Institute of Criminology found that 1 in 20 Australians had been doxed and that young people are more likely to be affected by it. Online spaces have increasingly become unsafe for women as well. This is a universal problem, and data shows us that women across the world are experiencing abuse and discrimination online, and I've seen it with my own eyes. When prominent women express their views online, they face a torrent of misogynist abuse. The harms of doxing are magnified for women where the release of their personal data is used in the context of domestic and family violence. The publishing of a woman's photo, workplace, home address, phone number or any personal details online is often used as a tool of intimidation and is often escalated into major emotional, professional and physical abuse. While the doxing happens online, the harms extend long beyond it. It impacts people's safety and sense of security. Doxing is often accompanied by other forms of harassment, such as the non-consensual sharing of intimate images or AI deepfakes. The situation facing women in this country is not new. It is without a question a national crisis, and this legislation is part of keeping women and families safer online. The Albanese Labor government has already acted to keep and to improve safety online for women, including by quadrupling ongoing base funding for the eSafety Commissioner. We also initiated a review of the Online Safety Act to ensure our laws are keeping up with the emerging online threats and harms. This legislation protects each and every one of them. This legislation seeks to protect every single Australian. I have met countless academics, artists, business owners and members of the McNamara community who have had similar experiences to Lee. And in every conversation with them, they have spoken about the pain that they endured after the doxing. And we spoke about what can be done to fix it. We spoke about making sure it doesn't happen again to the future, to any minority, to any person of faith, to any woman, to any child. The legislation before us seeks to fix this. This bill will impose a maximum 6 years imprisonment for publishing private details online, such as names, addresses and numbers, with the intent of causing harm. Importantly, this will be increased to 7 years when a person or group is targeted on the basis of their race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality or ethnic origin. It not only makes the practice of online doxing a criminal offence with high penalties, but importantly, it gives victims an avenue to seek redress before the courts. Redress for the emotional distress, but also for the impacts of businesses and livelihoods. This bill creates a new cause of action, which empowers victims to seek compensation directly from any person who commits serious invasion of their privacy. It is important to note that this bill does include safeguards for journalists and law enforcement officers in the proper discharge of their duties. By criminalising the release of an individual's personal data online in a manner that would be menacing or harassing, we not only hold perpetrators to account, but we set a tone for the standard of behaviour that is acceptable online. And most importantly, this legislation was developed after consultation with victims of online doxing, and it is designed to protect every single Australian. We must not accept abuse, harassment, misogyny and racism in our workplaces or schools. That behaviour would not be tolerated on the street, and now with this legislation, it will be targeted online as well. This legislation also reforms the Privacy Act. Acting Speaker, can I continue on?
The member has the call.
Thank you. This legislation also reforms the Privacy Act framework. The people of Macnamara and all other Australians expect their private information to be exactly that, private. The reforms in this bill follows from the Privacy Act review. It clarifies the objects of the Privacy Act and reaffirms our position that entities have a responsibility to protect Australians' personal information. It will increase transparency around automated decisions using personal information, and as the robo-debt scheme highlighted, significant harms can materialise when decision-making processes are automated. This bill will provide members of our community with transparency about their use of personal information. Privacy policies will be required to specify the kinds of personal information used in these sorts of decisions, and individuals will be able to request an explanation about how such automated decisions are made. Importantly, we are strengthening the Information Commissioner's enforcement powers. It will enhance the regulator's investigation powers to ensure that entities are handling personal information in a manner that Australians can respect and have confidence in. The other part of this bill, which is vital, is the development of a children's online privacy code, which will apply to social media and other internet services which are likely to be accessed by children. The Children's Online Privacy Code will specify how these entities must comply with privacy obligations in relation to children. And right now, young people and children don't remember a world without the online space. And while the online world can be a fantastic way to connect with the world, to learn and explore new ideas, the risks exposed to young people cannot be understated. The Privacy Act framework is currently not sufficient. It has not adapted to the needs of the digital age, nor has it responded to the large-scale data breaches of the last few years. Australians have a right to expect their personal information will be safe and protected, but more than that, they have a right to expect that those who treat their privacy with contempt will face the full force of the law. A poll by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner found that 89% of Australians want stronger legislation to protect their personal information, and 87% of parents want more protections for their children. And that is what this bill is all about. This bill is about strengthening the online space so it's safer for everyone. It's about protecting women and children from abuse. It's about protecting our community's most vulnerable online. It's about ensuring every single person of faith is safe and protected online. It's about stamping out discrimination and hatred. The reality of the online world is that we have seen massive changes in digital technology, and with that, we have seen insidious opportunities for invasions of privacy that have been emerging. And this affects thousands of people every single day. Every one of us in this place has struggled to keep up, but this bill has taken us all a major step forward. There is more work to do, but I commend this bill to the House, and I also particularly want to thank members of my community, and particularly those Jewish community members who have gone through this really stressful ordeal and have come through it making strong recommendations to government. I'm proud that we've been able to achieve this bill together, and I commend it to the House.
Thank you. The question is that the bill be agreed to, and I call the member for Nichols.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I too rise to speak on the Privacy and Other Legislation Bill 2024. And I understand that there will be further scrutiny of this bill, and I think that's a good thing because some of the elements of this bill are contested and they deserve further scrutiny. But in relation to Schedules 1 and 3 of the legislation, they're relatively uncontentious and they revolve around doxing. So the bill addresses the practice of doxing, and doxing can take several forms, but essentially the public release of private information or personal details without consent. And the E-Safety Commissioner has outlined several types of doxing. The de-anonymising doxing, revealing the identity of someone who was previously anonymous, for example, someone who used a pseudonym. Targeting doxing, revealing specific information about someone that allows them to be contacted or located, or results in their online security being breached, for example, their phone number or home address or account username and password being released. And also the delegitimising doxing, revealing sensitive or intimate information about someone that can damage their credibility or reputation. Now, the most recent example of doxing, which was very high profile, involved details of hundreds of Jewish members of a private WhatsApp group being published by pro-Palestinian advocates. Indeed, and that was the impetus to bring this bill forward. And the victims, amid a disgraceful rising tide of anti-Semitism in Australia, reported being shunned, suffering adverse professional and personal consequences, and in some cases death threats. And the Coalition rightly condemned the doxing of Jewish creatives and offered to work constructively to improve the legal framework. And we have for some time been supportive of laws to respond to doxing. The former Coalition government commissioned a review of the Privacy Act during the previous Parliament. Now, the purpose of the inquiry was to examine whether Australia's privacy laws were fit for purpose. However, the bill's not without controversy, and I do want to just make a few comments about Schedule 2 of the bill, and that is the schedule that it would establish a statutory tort for serious invasions of privacy. Now, the merits of putting that statutory tort into the bill are highly contestable, and we need to think about what the consequences of that would be. Any individual could sue any individual, including a body, corporate or a government, for misusing a person's personal information or intruding on their seclusion. Now, what that could lead to is more litigation, more people finding their way into courts, and the driving up of insurance premiums. Now, plaintiff and class action law firms are unsurprisingly very supportive of this, but there are many business organisations who do not, including ACCI, the BCA, who have expressed concern about Schedule 2. And I do continue to say to the government in this place, coming from such an entrepreneurial place as my electorate of Nichols is, which is really based on private enterprise, is that often the more of this legislation you put forward, the more cost it puts on business. Now, we can't have no legislation in relation to this, but we do need to think about what costs it puts on business and what impositions it puts on people trying to run private enterprise. Insurance premiums, risk of litigation, all of those things. And I do think there are unintended consequences that I would like to see further scrutiny of this bill examine. So ultimately, as we understand in the cost of living crisis, greater cost to business will be ultimately potentially passed on to consumers, and we need to consider that. So while the new doxing offences are welcome elements of this bill, and I congratulate the government on that, I think that Schedule 2 needs more scrutiny, and I worry about the unintended consequences, and I welcome further scrutiny of this bill, particularly Schedule 2. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that the bill be agreed to, and I call the member for Ryan. For Kooyong, I apologise.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Privacy and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2024 represents a significant legislative effort to modernise Australia's privacy framework and to address emerging challenges in the digital age. The bill proposes substantial changes to the Privacy Act 1988, reflecting the fact that it has not kept pace with Australians' widespread adoption and reliance upon digital technologies and the concomitant risks associated with these technologies, specifically that personal data could be subject to misuse or mishandling. Digital technologies can also be used as platforms for doxing, in which personal information is maliciously disclosed with the intent to cause harm. Doxing exposes victims to physical threats, to public embarrassment, to humiliation and shaming, to discrimination, identity theft, financial fraud and other serious harms. However, while the objectives of this bill are laudable, I'm quite concerned that this bill lacks clarity and specificity, and that its broad scope and its somewhat vague language could engender potential for overreach and for unintended consequences. One of the most significant concerns raised by this bill, concerns about which have been raised by many of my constituents, is its potential to stifle freedom of expression. The bill introduces a new statutory tort for serious invasions of privacy. The model of the statutory tort set out in the bill was informed by the Australian Law Reform Commission. It's intended to provide individuals with legal recourse against those who wrongfully intrude upon their private lives. And that's a worthy intent. However, the bill's broad language and its lack of clear definitions could create ambiguity that could chill legitimate forms of expression, particularly those that engage in investigative journalism or political satire. The bill attempts to address this concern by arguing that the tort will only capture actions that reasonable persons would regard as being menacing or harassing. However, the bill fails to provide a clear definition of what it constitutes as menacing or harassing behaviour. Its reliance on the concept of reasonable persons in its justification for limiting freedom of expression is also somewhat problematic. This ambiguity could lead to uncertainty. It could potentially disadvantage individuals who hold minority views or people who express themselves in unconventional ways. The bill also fails to provide sufficient guidance on what constitutes serious interference with privacy. There is no doubt that doxing is loathsome behaviour, and victims may have to take significant steps to mitigate the harm which unfortunately can result from this process. However, I'm concerned that this legislation's establishment of criminal offences for doxing doesn't adequately define the intent required for the act to be considered an offence. This bill could potentially criminalise the sharing of information that is publicly available, or information which is shared for legitimate purposes, such as whistleblowing or public interest reporting. Information is sometimes shared to reveal criminal behaviour. The bill relies heavily on a court-based enforcement mechanism for both the statutory tort for serious invasions of privacy and the criminal offences for doxing. That gives us the prospect of airing additional sensitive, potentially private information, which could be a disincentive to seeking redress under the legislation. Conversely, the threat of expensive and lengthy legal action could be a disincentive to freedom of expression. The bill introduces a new framework for eligible data breaches, empowering the Minister to expand the collection, the use and disclosure of personal information following significant data breaches. But the broad scope of those powers raises concerns about their potential to exacerbate privacy breaches. Moreover, I'm told by experts with whom I've consulted that the bill lacks robust oversight mechanisms to ensure that decisions are proportionate and necessary. An independent body or tribunal to review the Minister's decisions and to provide greater transparency and accountability might be desirable. This bill could represent a missed opportunity to create a truly comprehensive and balanced framework for privacy considerations. Engagement and further consultation with stakeholders could ensure that the bill strikes a better balance between privacy and other rights. The bill should be strengthened to effectively protect Australians' privacy while upholding fundamental freedoms. A more nuanced and balanced approach is needed to ensure that the law effectively protects privacy rights without unduly infringing upon other essential freedoms.
The question is that the bill be agreed to. I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I join with the other contributors who have essentially all made a very similar point. That is, we're very happy to be debating and passing what hopefully is the beginnings of reform and tightening of the law when it comes to the protection of privacy. I think it's fair to say that most contributions have suggested that we need to go further than what this bill does, and I strongly agree with that contention made in debate from other speakers. I mean, clearly, as when we had the debate recently around the digital ID bill, I certainly recall making this point. I think a lot of speakers made the point in debate on that bill, which was that we were really waiting for the government to tell us where they were heading when it came to reforms of the protection of people's privacy. And this bill would have been nice to have had sooner, and indeed it would have been nice to look at what this bill does and doesn't do in the context of some of the other legislation that we've had brought on for debate that is very relevant to the topic of privacy. We've got very deep concerns, and I think there's unanimity around this, that as data is much more abundant on people and also kept in a very different form to years gone by, decades, millennia gone by, where really at a computer screen a lot of people have access to people's personal information, and are the protections in our legislation strong enough? Clearly they're not, because this bill is the beginnings of reform in this area. I desperately hope not the end. And look, I commend the beginnings of some things that I'm sure most members think need to be more robust than what this legislation does. Yes, creating strong criminal penalties for breach of privacy, and a incrementally improved civil framework for dealing with breaches of privacy. But frankly, I mean, this is an area of law, it's an area of dispute that I think is going to be extremely significant in the years and decades ahead. And I hope this Parliament is always landing on the side of protecting the privacy of Australians, protecting privacy both where government keeps information and people within government have access to information of Australian citizens, and indeed where corporations and other entities in civil society are doing the same as well. So look, this is legislation that is the beginnings of heading in the right direction, but as other members have talked about in their contributions, we really hope the government's got a lot more planned than what is before us in this legislation. So given we're in the consideration in detail, my question would be to the Attorney-General to perhaps seek a clear understanding of what the government has planned beyond this legislation, because obviously speakers have talked about a desire for a lot more than just what's in this legislation to be considered, and I'm sure, I say in good faith that I'm sure that the government has got a lot more planned in regards to strengthening protections of people's privacy, but there are legitimate issues that have already been raised, and it would be good to know what, if anything, the government has in plans for further reform in this area, because this bill is the beginning of certain steps in a certain direction, but we certainly would like to see a lot of other issues around privacy protection considered. So members have talked about some of the specific elements in the legislation, like doxing, etc., and we absolutely condemn some of the awful examples that we've seen in recent times this legislation touches upon. There are obviously a lot of other potential risks into the future. We mentioned that in the debate on the digital ID bill. I'm very concerned about a whole amount of data that governments in particular collect on people. We obviously reflect on medical data, other information that we're providing to government that's being more and more centralised and more shared, and protections and appropriate penalties to dissuade misuse are very important as well. And with those comments, I'll leave it for any response to the issue that I've raised.
The question is that the bill be agreed to, and I call the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Earlier this year, almost 600 Jewish writers, artists and academics found themselves targets of a cruel and malicious act. Their names and personal details were published online by activists. They were part of a private WhatsApp group, a forum where they could support each other in the face of rising tide of anti-Semitism many had never experienced before. This space, meant for safety and solidarity and questioning and sharing views, was cruelly violated when a 900-page transcript of their private conversations, along with their personal information, was leaked by one of the group's members. This transcript, containing the intimate details of their lives, was then published online, and the consequences were devastating. In the words of one Jewish member of the WhatsApp group, imagine you wake up one morning to find your name, photo, contact details and workplace published on social media, where you are wrongly accused of all manners of sins in an anti-Semitic online campaign that spreads on the internet in what seems like milliseconds. Death threats follow. You are afraid to leave the house. You lose your jobs, friends or customers, or you are shunned by colleagues, or all of these things happen based on the false information disseminated online. This is not an isolated case. This person reflects the broader experience of many in that group. The doxing unleashed a wave of anti-Semitism, and what makes it most, I think, harrowing for the community is it echoes some of the anti-Semitism and some of the vilification of the Jewish people for generations, starting with the 1930s, where people were again outed for being Jewish and they were targeted in various ways, including their businesses. And we know where that ended, and that ended in the Holocaust. Members of the group were labelled as a cabal of Zionist conspirators, reminiscent of the anti-Semitic tropes that have plagued Jewish communities for centuries. No one should be vilified in this country. No one's privacy should be breached in this country on the basis of their religion, their beliefs, their sexuality. No one should be subject to what has happened to these people. And Deputy Speaker, despite the clear harm caused by this act of doxing and despite the undeniable malicious intent behind it, this behaviour was not illegal under Australian law. And this is a profound failure of our legal system. Alongside leaders of the Jewish community, I've called loudly and repeatedly for change from the moment this came out. We need laws that recognise the severity of doxing and treat it as the criminal and intimidating act that it is. This bill does that, and so takes an important step forward. And I thank the Attorney-General in particular for his work in driving this. It creates 2 new criminal offences specifically addressing doxing. The first offence makes it illegal to publish or distribute someone's personal data in a way that is menacing, harassing or harmful. The second provision goes further, making it a crime to publish or share the personal information of members of a group, where the group is distinguished by a protected attribute such as race, religion or sexual orientation. These offences come with significant penalties, including a maximum sentence of up to 7 years imprisonment. These are serious crimes and they will now be treated by such as the law. Deputy Speaker, this legislation and the new offences it introduces have been welcomed by people in my electorate and by leaders of the Australian Jewish community. It's a significant and necessary step in criminalising some of the most egregious acts of anti-Semitism and hate speech we have witnessed over the past year. However, while this legislation is a positive step, it is not sufficient on its own to stem the rising tide of anti-Semitism and hate that we are seeing in our country. And so it is vital that we continue to build on these reforms. In particular, I will continue to urge the government to deliver on its promise to introduce further protections against serious vilification as part of changes to the Criminal Code, as the Attorney-General committed to earlier this year. This has support of leaders of the Jewish community and of the LGBTQ plus community, another very important part of my community. We need robust, comprehensive legal protections that not only punish the acts of serious vilification, but also deter them. I'm making a submission to the Senate inquiry in relation to this bill at the moment, because while I support where the bill is going, it is not going far enough, and we need greater protections for Australians of all beliefs. And to make sure that that hateful vilification is not acceptable in this country and carries punishment. This is not just about protecting one community. This is about upholding the values of tolerance, respect and safety for all Australians, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs.
I call the member for point, please.
And this, these legal frameworks, and I respect the work that is being done on doxing, and I respect, work while I want to extend it in relation to vilification and hate speech. But I think we have a deeper thing that we need to do in this country, and is we need to reflect on what is happening in relation to how we treat each other and how we behave. And we need to, I think, really guard against it, every single one of us in our country, in terms of how we behave. Now, let me give you an example. I have a community forum. I have students who come to see me every term. And this term, I had a group of year 10, 11 students from many of my schools around my community. And I always ask the students, what's important to you? What do you want me to know? What should be on my list? And one young woman stood up and said, I'm worried about going to university next in 2 years' time. She's a young Jewish woman in my community, and that was one of her greatest concerns, was whether she would be welcome, whether she would be safe, and whether she would be able to participate in university in the way that any other Australian student should anticipate participating in university life. And this is absolutely devastating to hear. And she was not alone in this group of about 16 kids. This was one of the biggest concerns that this young woman had. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why I'm most concerned about the attitudes that we are seeing and some of the behaviour that we are seeing across our community. I see this in my schools. I had a young man in a similar forum last term tell me about his experience of walking down the street and wearing his school uniform and being concerned about whether he is safe wearing his school uniform, which shows that he goes to a Jewish school, and that a person driving along the street, slowing down, pulling over and swearing at him about being Jewish and then making a Nazi salute in the streets in my community. Now, this sort of behaviour is unacceptable. It is un-Australian. It is, as a non-Jewish member of the community, it's shocking to me that people would think that this is some sort of behaviour, that is part of, that can fit within this country. And so I think that this is, we can change the laws. We need to take much stronger action at the universities to change the behaviour at the universities and change the mindset, I think, of our universities. We need to, in my community, make sure that all of our kids are standing up against anti-Semitism and, frankly, any kind of hate or any kind of vilification. There has no place for this. And we need to all reflect, I think, on ourselves in terms of how we can make sure that in all of our actions and in all of our words, we are bringing people together and we are trying to build on the strength of this country. Because my mum came out to this country, like many people, as a 10-year-old who didn't speak English, came out as an Italian, and she had a wonderful life and had a wonderful acceptance in the Australian community. And, this is, I think, that acceptance and that sort of quality is what we need to continue to build. So this is up to everybody as well as up to us in our legislation, in what we do. This is up to sort of myself and others to constantly lead and constantly call out the behaviour that we see and say this is unacceptable. And I'll continue to say that. Anti-Semitic behaviour, but basically vilification, hate towards anyone on the basis of their characteristics is unacceptable in this country and is un-Australian. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be agreed to. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I ask leave of the House to move amendments 1 through to 4 as circulated in my name together.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you. I move amendments 1 to 4 as circulated in my name together. Deputy Speaker, Australia's Privacy Act is not only outdated, it's simply not fit for purpose anymore. And it is fundamentally failing to keep up with the rapid rise of technologies that rely on vast quantities of personal information. But given the Act was introduced in 1988, prior to Australia even joining the global internet, and in the same year as the Brisbane Expo, I might add, here in Australia, espoused that by 1988 we would all be living lives of wonderful luxury because the internet will have helped us become obsolete, it's not surprising that this Act no longer works. Fast forward to today, and the reality is digital technologies are rapidly making all elements of this Act almost obsolete. Artificial intelligence has stretched beyond the confines of science fiction. Our biometric data is used by shopping centres for targeted advertising. Our social media photos are used to train AI. And our devices record and often share the details of our daily lives, our habits and our behaviours. I'm sure every single person in this room has had that experience where they will have a discussion with somebody that they love about something they might be considering purchasing or doing, only to then find when they go onto a social platform on their next iteration on their device, that option is sitting right in front of them amongst its advertising. Recent major data breaches have definitely raised public awareness and have further highlighted the need for wide-ranging reform of our privacy safeguards. According to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, just under half all Australians say they were affected by a data breach in the previous year, and 3/4 have experienced harm as a result of that breach. They report having their personal information stolen, being unable to unsubscribe from marketing communications, and having to provide sensitive information when they preferred not to. As a result, many are left feeling disempowered, stressed and anxious. The bill before us then is welcome, particularly the new civil penalties and the pathway towards establishing a children's online privacy code and the statutory tort for serious invasions. However, while the measures in the bill will strengthen Australia's privacy law, this modest legislation alone will not bring Australian privacy law into line with global best practice, and it is disappointing that the government has stopped short of truly modernising our privacy legislation. Ultimately, the Privacy Act Review report put forward 116 proposals for reform of Australia's privacy framework, of which the government has agreed or agreed in principle to 106. And yet this bill aims to implement just 23 of those proposals. And for this reason, I will continue to call on the government to introduce the second tranche of privacy reforms before the next federal election. But dealing with what we have here, among the many omissions in this bill is the absence of a fair and reasonable test for dealing with personal information. No requirement that entities take steps to mitigate harm to individuals following a data breach, no clarification of timeframes for notification of data breach, and no updated definitions of personal information or consent. Yet one of the most significant reforms that is included in this bill is the introduction of a statutory tort or a civil wrong that will allow Australians to sue for damages for serious invasions of privacy and enable courts to award damages, grant injunctions and make a range of other orders. And while I do think this is a good development, I am concerned that the proposed exemptions are unnecessarily broad. Specifically, the bill introduces new and broad exemptions for journalists, enforcement bodies and intelligence agencies that deviate from the model proposed by the Australian Law Reform Commission and endorsed by the Privacy Act Review. The journalism exemption would exclude any acts ostensibly done while developing journalistic material and would apply regardless of the content or the purpose of the journalism. This would mean that blatantly illegal and unjustifiable infringements of privacy by journalists that are not in the public interest would be exempt from the right of action. This might include illegal phone hacking by a news corporation or upskirting photos taken of celebrities by a tabloid. And I can't help but think many people would rightly expect that this is precisely the type of infringement that this tort should apply to. Serious infringements of privacy without a principled justification. In addition, the exemptions for enforcement bodies and intelligence agencies are unjustifiably broad, in my opinion, given there is a separate defence already for invasions of privacy that are required or authorised by law that would already cover lawful government interference with privacy. The detailed amendments I'm moving today then would narrow the journalism exemptions to apply to public interest journalism and better clarify the application of the enforcement bodies and National Security Agency exemptions. And I commend the amendments to the government.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I call the Attorney-General.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. The government does not support the amendments that have been moved by the member for North Sydney, but I am grateful for the support that the member for North Sydney has expressed for the bill itself. The government has given careful consideration to the breadth of the proposed exemptions and defences to ensure that protection of privacy is appropriately balanced with other legitimate activities. The defence for conduct authorised by law would apply to conduct that is expressly authorised or impliedly authorised where the conduct is clearly necessary to carry out an activity authorised under statute. This is consistent with a similar exception to a number of the Australian privacy principles. Exempting all journalistic material from the tort will protect the free flow of information to the public through the media. Seeking to confine the exemption to material that is in the public interest would lead to arguments about the merits of publications and would only serve to increase the length and expense of court proceedings. The exemptions for enforcement bodies and intelligence agencies are intended to ensure that these entities are not unduly restricted in carrying out their legitimate functions. It recognises that in some instances these may need to be privacy intrusive. These agencies do have their own oversight processes and mechanisms that regulate their conduct, which are designed to suit their operating environment.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, and thank you for your response, Attorney General. Can I just ask then a clarifying point? So, to your commentary just then, this bill does introduce broad exemptions for journalism that could potentially, I'm concerned, it will potentially cover unjustifiable infringements like upskirting, which is where a photographer will take a photo of a celebrity with the camera going directly up underneath their clothing, or even phone hacking, which we saw in the not too distant past, specifically in the UK. Can you please confirm whether, under the current bill, these activities would be exempt?
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. Call the member.
Raised by the member for North Sydney, I can say that this bill introduces what will be a new tort to Australian law for serious invasions of privacy. As with the development of other parts of tort law, we will see, as proceedings are brought, what the courts choose to describe as the full extent of the tort and the civil wrong that's been created by this legislation, and the extent of the defences. I'm not going to predict in advance exactly what the parameters of this tort are going to be. That's going to be a matter for case law to work through.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I'll put the question. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no.
Aye.
No.
Okay, as the question is unresolved in accordance with Standing Order 188, the question will be included in the Federation Chamber's report to the House on the bill. The question is that the bill be agreed to, and I call a member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I ask leave of the Chamber to move Amendments 1 and 2 as circulated in my name together.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
I move Amendments 1 and 2 as circulated in my name together. Deputy Speaker, one must only read the title of the Act, which determines Australian privacy law today, the Privacy Act 1988, to realise we might have a problem. The world was very different in 1988. Office desks had in-trays and out-trays for physical letters. The word email was one mostly used in the vernacular of academic and other niche circles, and the idea of a personal computer was one for science fiction. Throughout the 21st century, successive Australian governments have iteratively amended the Privacy Act to manage the rapidly accelerating and unpredictable change brought by technological progress to account for the once nascent but now fundamental concept of digital privacy. Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, the gold standard, inspired various other countries to enact similarly ambitious law, but not here, not for Australia. The failure of our Privacy Act to fully scale to the demands of the digital era has been as dramatic as it has destructive. Just look to the headlines of recent years. The Guardian, November 2022, hackers released records they claim are related to mental health and alcohol issues. ABC, April 2024, following the Optus breach, more than 300,000 attempts of identity fraud blocked. If these headlines show one thing, it's that the modern challenges of cyberspace have been too much for our Privacy Act to withstand, and individual Australians have largely been left to manage the deeply personal and lasting consequences of its failure, with many the victims of scams and other invasive offences. A new tort to combat doxing is a start, but it's too little too late for the Jewish Australian creatives impacted earlier this year, many of whom live in my electorate of Goldstein. The problem is pervasive. According to the Consumer Policy Research Centre, if an Australian user were to maximise the privacy settings for all the apps and websites they use daily, it would take us 30 minutes of toggling every day to do it. That's 2 minutes for every app we tap and website we visit. This takes a European user, on average, just 30 seconds. My question to this is why? And I'm not sure that the government has given us a good answer. There's no reason why Australia can't legislate a regime of privacy reform on par with international best practice, which is why I'm moving amendments which amend the definitions of personal information and consent in line with both the best international practice and the expectations of the Australian public. The low bar at which these two concepts are defined in Australian law enables the internet activity of Australians to be tracked across the internet to a greater extent than many other OECD nations. These two amendments are targeted improvements and do not represent the full scope of reform that needs to be done for our Privacy Act to meet international best practice, but redefining these two pivotal concepts is a start. Doing so would deal with a range of digital harms and offer certainty to businesses currently subject to Privacy Act regulation. Rather than wait, we can do this now. The definition of personal information needs to be expanded to include information that's both inferred and technical, such as IP addresses and device identifiers, where this information could be used to identify an individual. As it stands, if data does not meet this definition, none of the Australian privacy principles apply. This amendment creates a framework whereby the privacy of individuals is protected from systems which track their behaviour online, and this includes the unique fingerprints left by their devices, like the type of device that they use, their geographic location, and various other forms of metadata. This includes where a person could be individuated in a data set by such inferred or technical information even when their name isn't known. My second amendment updates the definition of consent and brings it in line with the digital era. Instead of consent being something that can currently only be expressed or implied, my amendment would revise it to one which must be voluntary, informed, current, specific and unambiguous. If this definition had been in place earlier, Meta may not have been able to scrape the social media profile data of Australians to train their AI models. These amendments are a strong start to improving the privacy of Australian citizens. Each is not only in line with international best practice, but is in line with the expectations of the Australian public, and I commend these amendments to the House.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I call the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's reflective of the complete lack of interest that the former government had in the Privacy Act that the only set of amendments that were produced by the former government for the whole of the 9 years between 2013 and 2022 were amendments that I brought to the House in May of 2013 to create a scheme of notifiable data breaches. The then Liberal opposition said that they were in favour of the scheme of notifiable data breaches that were contained in a bill that I gave the catchy title Privacy Alerts to. And unfortunately, the bill, having passed the House of Representatives in 2013, lapsed on the proroguing of Parliament for the election in 2013. And the bill, despite the support expressed for it by the then Liberal opposition, did not reappear for another 3 years and did not become law. That is, a scheme of notifiable data breaches did not become law until January of 2018. That is reflective of the near complete lack of interest that the Liberal opposition, when they were in government, had in bringing the Privacy Act, which the member for Goldstein rightly points out was passed in 1988, into the digital age. I don't detect from any of the things that any members have said about this legislation that it's other than supported. and indeed everybody appears to recognise the need for very substantial updating of the Privacy Act to bring it into the digital age. And that's, of course, the process that the government is now embarked on, but it's going to be a big process. The amendments that are moved by the member for Goldstein propose updated wording for the definitions of personal information and consent. These are among the matters that were considered by the very broad review of the Privacy Act that was carried out by the Attorney-General's Department, which the government has published, along with a later response by our government to that very broad review of the Privacy Act. We have agreed in principle that the definitions of both of those terms, that is personal information and consent, should be updated. To make it clear, as I did when I was introducing this bill, the Privacy and Other Legislation Amendment Bill is just the first stage of the government's commitment to providing individuals with greater control over their personal information and bringing this legislation into the digital age so that it's fit for purpose. The government has clearly stated that it intends to continue to advance proposals that it has agreed to in principle to progress the response to the Privacy Act review. We are conducting targeted consultations with stakeholders on draft provisions. It's really important to ensure that the amended definitions, which are foundational to the operation of the Act, are drafted carefully so that they are fit for purpose and workable in a diverse range of contexts. And for that reason, the government does not support the amendments as moved by the member for Goldstein, which is not to say in any way that there's a disagreement in principle, which is that along with many other provisions in the Privacy Act, there is a need for amendment and for the whole of the Act to be brought up to date.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise in support of the amendments that we've just heard moved by the member for Goldstein, because I want to just take a moment and reflect on how infinitely reasonable the amendments were that she has suggested to the government of today. And I thank the Attorney-General for giving us the background on reviews of this Act since it was introduced in 1988. But I would posit that the challenge we now face is that we have a moment in time where there is a government that is prepared to move forward in reform in this area, but it is moving so slowly that we may find ourselves in a situation where we are back in the polls in the next year and we have a change in government, which means we get no further. So I guess in reflecting on the fact that the Attorney-General has just rejected the amendments as moved by the member for Goldstein, I would ask of the Attorney-General, what is the timeline on the government for doing this work, which we have all universally agreed today in the chamber is needed? It's well past due. Can Australians expect to see this reform before the next election?
Call the Attorney-General.
Speaker, the government is consulting, as I've said, on further amendments to the Privacy Act. That is a targeted consultation about draft provisions, and I'm hopeful of bringing a further stage of amendment to the Privacy Act to the Parliament in coming months.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I'll put the question. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the noes have it. Ayes have it. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. And I call the clerk.
Government Business, Order of the Day number 3, Better and Fairer Schools Funding and Reform Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Morton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, for being so considerate. I have stood in this chamber and spoken before about the critical importance of providing equal access and opportunity to education in this country. In fact, some people might cruelly say that I only have 3 speeches and the education one is my favourite one. However, this topic is crucial because education is the foundation we all need in order to go on and thrive in life, in our careers and in our head. Education opens doors and leads to prosperity, to purpose and to well-being. It can offer transformative opportunities. One of the key features of this nation, I think, is that education can transform our lives. We are not consigned by birth if we have a good education. Whether you live in the middle of one of our cities or in a small community in the bush, Australians should have the same educational opportunities, and the opportunities should be the same regardless of what your parents can afford. Deputy Speaker, that is where our mighty public school system comes into play. There are more than 6,700 public primary and high schools scattered across Australia. Like St George State High School that I attended, Trinity Bay State High School that my wife attended, Brisbane South State Secondary College that my son attends right now. Hopefully he's there today. So, these schools, our state schools, are open to everyone. The classrooms are filled with children of different cultural and religious and language backgrounds. Public schools also cater to the most disadvantaged children in this country. Students from poorer families, students from rural and remote Australia, First Nations students, students with a disability. Every gate welcomes all to pass through it. And that is why I'm pleased to support the Better and Fairer Schools Funding and Reform Bill. It proposes to amend the Australian Education Act and increase funding for Australia's public schools to help to ensure equality of access. Importantly, the bill protects Commonwealth funding going forward and ensures that it cannot go backwards. And it also includes requirements for transparency about outcomes, so school communities and families can see the positive changes occurring as a result of increased funding. The funding is part of the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement. This is due to replace the current National School Reform Agreement, which expires at the end of this year. The new agreement will run for 10 years until the end of 2034, so it delivers much more certainty. With the joys of those 4-year budgets, it's great to see a system where we will have funding certainty way out to 2034. At the core of the new agreement is the assurance that all public schools will receive full and fair funding. It puts every public school on a path to 100% of the Schooling Resource Standard, or the SRS. Now this gets a little bit boring, but the SRS, you need to remember that the recommendation of the Gonski Review back in 2011. Now Gonski, people have heard that name. You need to remember that he was a banker. He was focused on productivity and economic reform. He wasn't a teacher or a school officer, a school aide. He was someone who just saw education as almost as an economic commodity. And that was a good thing, because the SRS, the Schooling Resource Standard, is an estimate of the level of government funding that a school needs to meet the educational requirements of its students. Government funding. Some parents will still have to make some contributions. Theoretically, it is free, but we all know that there are some things that you need to pay extra money for. Currently, the base amount per student is $13,570 for a primary school student and $17,053 for a high school student. David Gonski recommended additional funding or loading for the following cohorts: students with disability, First Nations students, and interestingly it was all First Nations students, so even though half of First Nations students live in the cities, overall there was still some institutional, generational disadvantage in there. He also wanted more funding for those with socio-educational disadvantage, students with low English proficiency, as well as extra funding depending on the size and the location of the school. As I said, not because David Gonski was some bleeding heart liberal, but because he saw the economic returns that would go to business and to this nation. The Gonski model is needs-based. This means that at non-government schools, the base amount per student is reduced and takes into account the average income of the parents at the school. Not just the surrounding area, but the actual data of the school, the parents that send their kids to that school. As a result, the school may only receive a percentage of the SRS base amount. It's a better model because in the past, sometimes, like my hometown of St George, which was a disadvantaged one, kids from St George that went to a boarding school dragged the poor postcode with them to their boarding school, and the boarding school got the advantage, I guess, of that old postcode, even though they were, to go to a boarding school, perhaps they were some of the wealthier people in the town. So this is trying to correct that and going to the actual parents. Every state school gate accepts everyone in its catchment, defined catchment. Some go a little bit broader, but the general rule is they have their enrolment managed. But it is also true that schools look like their surrounds. So wealthier suburbs do produce wealthier schools. Battling suburbs, have students that have more challenges. The way the Commonwealth government funding is split with the states and territories is different for non-government and public schools. Non-government's a different arrangement. For non-government schools, the Commonwealth is responsible for 80% of the funding, with the states and territories contributing 20%. With public schools, the Commonwealth provides 20% of the funding and the states and territories fund 75%. You don't need to have passed maths at St George State High with the late great Mick McMullen to work out that there is a 5% shortfall. The Albanese Labor government has been working hard to resolve this. The fabulous Minister for Education, Jason Clare, and his team are committed to getting all public schools on a path to 100% of the SRS. This pathway opens up with contributions from both the Commonwealth Government and the individual states and territories. The Australian Education Act currently indicates that the Commonwealth pay a maximum of 20% of the SRS to public schools. This bill makes this 20% a minimum, not a maximum. So all those people that went to state schools, such as Brisbane State High, and I see some students from Brisbane State, graduates from Brisbane State High in the background there, Libby Crocker and Dean Crocker, still involved with Brisbane State High and the great work that it does. What this means is that the Commonwealth proportion of the funding becomes a new baseline for the states and territories. This will become legislation, meaning that the increased funding levels are confirmed and cannot be changed without further amendments to the Act. So far in 2024, the Albanese government has announced new public school funding deals with the governments of Western Australia, with Tasmania and the Northern Territory. This is good news for students and families and means more funding from the 1st of January next year. Funding certainty. The road to full funding in these agreements is short and straightforward. Every public school in WA will be fully funded by the 1st of January 2026. Good news for Western Australians, I'd imagine. In Tasmania, the public schools will be fully funded by 2029, and the changes are even more substantial in the Northern Territory, an area in Australia that has a lot of educational challenges, especially once you move outside Darwin. The Northern Territory currently receives less funding than anywhere else in Australia. It is unacceptable that the public schools in the Territory, their students receive around 80% less than they should get under the Konski recommendations. The new agreement with the Territory Government fixes this inequity. Funding for public schools in the Northern Territory will double, and we have fast-tracked the path to a full funding by more than 20 years. To repeat, the reforms in this bill mean that the new baseline level of funding from the Commonwealth for public schools will be 20% in all jurisdictions, except for the Northern Territory, which will be 40% from 2029 because of their special challenges. The other part of this bill that is important is the accountability measures it puts in place for school funding. Transparency and accountability will be included as a purpose of the amended Act. This includes a requirement for the Minister for Education to deliver an annual report on the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement and the states and territories. As the Minister for Education put it, the funding agreements are not a blank cheque. They include reform targets such as phonics and numeracy checks early on in a student's primary school journey, so that adjustments and extra support can be provided if necessary. Other measures include additional funding for mental health and wellbeing, with qualified staff to deliver services, something particularly important for those kids that have gone through the COVID, that COVID hiccup, shall we say, that put a number of years behind when it comes to educational attainments. And teaching staff and school leaders will be supported to access targeted professional development. There will be incentives for teachers to work in schools that are assessed to need additional support. The states and territories will also be required to publicly deliver reports on progress to ensure transparency. Deputy Speaker, this bill is just a part of a package of Labor reforms that support Australians in their educational journeys. We are boosting teacher numbers with an additional 4,000 places in teaching degrees and $56 million for Commonwealth teaching scholarships. Reflecting our commitment to equal access, the priority cohorts for these scholarships are First Nations peoples, people from the bush, from rural, regional and remote areas, and also people with disability. The Albanese government has targeted the improvement of school infrastructure, particularly state school infrastructure, with $490 million for round 1 and 2 of the school's upgrade fund for new and enhanced facilities, upgraded IT equipment and the development of outdoor learning spaces. And I know that schools in my electorate have taken advantage of that scheme. We've increased the wages of our early childhood educators, underlying our commitment to the retention and growth of this crucial workforce, something that everyone involved in the childcare sector would be appreciative of, I'm sure. It also directly benefits the 1.8 million Australian children aged 0 to 5, the key years for brain, language and social development. In other words, the building blocks for good health, education and well-being later in life. We've also invested in higher education. The Labor government directed $2.7 million over 2 years from 2022-23 to conduct a 12-month review of the Australian higher education system, and the result was the Australian Universities Accord. The substantial reforms already underway include wiping $3 billion of student help debt, providing a prac payment for teaching, nursing, midwifery and social work students, and expanding the fee-free university-ready course program. We've also bolstered TAFE enrolments with our fee-free TAFE initiative. This has seen over 508,000 enrolments since January last year. The program has removed financial barriers to training while focusing on addressing the skill shortages that we were left with. I'm proud that this program will continue under a Labor government. And on the weekend, Prime Minister Albanese announced 3 million Australians with student debt will have their debt cut by 20%. 20% if Labor wins the next election. For the average student, this means a cut of more than $5,000. For some with larger debts, it's more than that. Bizarrely, the LNP opposed this policy. Now that's a referendum at the ballot box that will make Jules Campbell, the Labor candidate for Moreton, very happy. Also make Renee Coffey in Griffith very happy, I'd imagine, member for Blair. Very happy to go to the election on that. So if you vote Labor uni students, you get a 20% discount. That's a great campaign. We know university used to be a lot cheaper. I know that when I went to Teachers College, I went for free. In fact, I was paid to go to Teachers College. I did have to pay for my... Was that a good investment? It was a good investment. 11 years of teaching that I loved. Then I did have to pay HECS on my arts degree and my law degree, which was fair enough. So it's not fair for this generation of students who are paying a larger percentage towards their tertiary education than I did. We are also raising the threshold that people can earn before they start having to make their HECS repayment. With these measures, Labor is taking action on intergenerational inequality and enabling many more Australians to further study after school. The Coalition left us a skills catastrophe and we're fixing it. The reforms in this bill lead to an additional $16 billion in funding for Australian schools if all states and territories sign up. I'm proud to say this is the biggest extra investment in public education ever. As a proud graduate of St George State High and as a former state school English, geography and history teacher, I know how, and as the parent of a kid at a state school, I know how important this investment is. Ultimately, Deputy Speaker, we can only trust a Labor government to make sure students, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, are not being left behind. To do so is better for the nation, to do so is better for business, to do so is better for our kids, and I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to contribute on the second reading of this bill and, even more importantly, the amendment that's been moved by a Greens member because the position of the Greens when it comes to school funding is very important and very relevant to all Australians, but particularly to the people of my electorate of Sturt. I have 56% of enrolment in secondary education in my electorate of Sturt is with the non-government school sector. And that's more than half the families in my electorate of Sturt send their children in secondary school to a non-government school. And of course, regrettably, the Greens have a radical and frightening policy position to defund non-government schools. And if they get their way and they're successful at the next election and they can implement their values when it comes to school funding, they'll be ripping away the entirety of taxpayer funding to the non-government school sector. And that is truly frightening to me, to the parents in my electorate of Sturt who send their children to non-government schools, and any parent around the country who either send their children now to non-government schools or intend to in the future. This will be the most radical defunding of education in the history of the Commonwealth of Australia. And that is the proposition that the Greens seek to implement if they succeed in having some kind of powerful position post the next election. Why? Well, the Greens, of course, are a communist party, and at every opportunity they want government to do absolutely everything. And so they hate the non-government school sector because that is not the government providing an option for parents to educate their children. And it's even worse when it comes to the non-government school sector, Mr Deputy Speaker, because of course almost the entirety of non-government schools are run by the faith-based sector. And when it comes to the Greens, something they hate beyond just not government doing something is the faith-based sector providing services to our community like education. My position couldn't be more the reverse than the Greens when it comes to that, whether it's education, whether it's aged care, whether it's so many programs that the faith sector provide in our community. We are lucky and we are grateful to them for what they do. And the hatred that the Greens have for the faith community and the faith sector, we will bitterly resist and oppose at every opportunity. But their position on defunding non-government schools is probably the one that would have the most frightening impact, particularly to my constituents. And that's why I take the opportunity in this debate on school funding to make it very clear there is an election coming up in less than 6 months. And I think, regrettably, the Greens have had these crazy policy positions for a long, long time, and not enough attention has been put on the positions that they hold. Now, in the last 12 months, I think people are starting to wake up to the Greens, who they really are, what they really stand for, and what the consequences of voting for the Greens, empowering them and putting them in decision-making positions might have on the lives of everyday Australians. And my hope is that people take a much closer look at the policy positions of the Greens at the next election than they have in the past. The Greens were a very different political force 10, 20, 30 years ago. They were very much an environmental movement that became a political party. And in the era of Bob Brown, certainly, they were focused on environmental issues and things that I have a great deal of support towards, around much better custody of our environment, addressing important issues like climate change and other environmental risk. But what has clearly happened in the last 10 years or so is that the Greens' environmental political movement has been hijacked by the old socialists and communists, whose brand was completely trashed through the decades of the post-Second World War era up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and of course were thoroughly, comprehensively rejected as a political option by the Australian voters consistently through that time. They have infiltrated the Greens political party, and they have brought their insane policy positions with them. Whether it's school funding and scrapping support for the non-government sector, whether it's private health insurance, getting rid of the private health insurance rebate, reintroducing death taxes on inheritance. In my home state of South Australia, they want to scrap the naval shipbuilding sector completely. More than 10,000 jobs in the South Australian economy gone. All these things will have an enormous impact on the people of Sturt, on the people of South Australia, on the people of Australia. But I do actually think, regrettably, the most significant and serious is their frightening position on funding towards non-government schools. Now, I say very clearly to the non-government school sector that we in the Coalition back you, support you. We are here to make sure that the quite appropriate, justified and necessary financial support that you receive from the taxpayer, and 80% comes from the Commonwealth, of school funding to the non-government sector, that will absolutely be there reliably under a coalition government. But the threat to it, regrettably, is the frightening scenario of the Greens political party holding some kind of balance of power after the next election and using that balance of power to implement their radical agenda. Number one on their list, unfortunately, is the non-government school sector and funding from the taxpayer to the non-government school sector. That will increase school fees on the parents of my electorate of Sturt by thousands of dollars a year on average. And in the middle of this cost of living crisis, the last thing that the people of Sturt need, 56% of the parents in Sturt send their children to a non-government school. The last thing that they need is their school fees going up by thousands and thousands of dollars a year because the Greens have been able to implement their frightening agenda to defund the non-government school sector. Now, this will be a debate that will, I think, be very significant in my electorate and many electorates through the campaign that is already underway. And there'll be a spotlight on the position that the Greens have to defund non-government schools like there never has before, because the unfortunate reality is that there is a higher likelihood than ever that they will be in a position to hold a future potential minority Labor government to ransom on these issues if we don't call them out on their policy positions and if we don't ensure that we defeat them at the next election. We are lucky and grateful to have the non-government school sector in this country. In some electorates like mine, they educate more than half the students. Parents actively make a choice to send their children to a non-government school. We believe in choice and we believe in those options being properly and appropriately supported through taxpayer funds. Don't forget, an enormously higher amount of money goes to the government sector generally and on a per-student basis than the non-government sector. If we didn't have the non-government sector, the cost of providing education in this country would absolutely explode. And that means higher taxes for everyone. So on top of the increased school fees for parents under the Greens school funding policies, we'd also have to dramatically increase taxation on all Australians to fund the enormous growth that would be necessary in funding the government sector, because of course a lot of parents wouldn't be able to afford, if their school fees go up by thousands of dollars a year, to keep their kids in the schools that they're in right now. I condemn the Greens for this dangerous policy, but I give them a commitment that I will join with them in making sure everyone knows where they stand when it comes to funding the non-government sector, or in their case, defunding it.
I thank the member. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Blair.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to speak on the Better and Fairer Schools Funding and Reform Bill 2024. The fact we have a good education system in this country, but it can be a lot better and a lot fairer. And the legislation can help us achieve this by increasing funding to public schools in my home state of Queensland, known as state schools, across the country, and removing the current funding cap that stopped the Commonwealth from providing additional funding to state schools. At the moment, the maximum the Commonwealth Government can provide to state schools is 20% of the schooling resource standard, and the bill turns that maximum into a minimum and turns that ceiling into a floor. The bill will enable additional funding to flow to the states and territories who've signed up to the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement, or BFSA. It's a landmark piece of legislation, this will allow us to deliver more funding to state schools and tie that funding to reforms to help lift student outcomes, set targets and improve school funding transparency. The funding's not without conditions. We make no apologies for tying this additional money to reforms that support teachers and help students catch up, keep going and finish school. Includes practical things like phonics checks, numeracy checks, evidence-based teaching and catching up tutoring. We want to identify those young people who are students who need additional support and make sure they get it. Now, we're investing billions of dollars in public schools and we want to make sure that money makes a difference. Clearly, it needs to. The BFSA is a 10-year agreement developed in collaboration with state and territory governments, First Nations, education representatives and non-government peak education bodies. To date, Western Australia, Tasmania and Northern Territory have signed up to Commonwealth's BFSA offer. We've put $16 billion of additional funding in state schools on the table and continue to work with the remaining states and territories to fully fund schools across the country. This will represent the biggest extra investment in state education by the Australian government in the country's history. So legislation is about fully funding our state schools and tying that funding to reforms to keep students in education and to finish their school. At the moment, non-government schools are funded at the level David Gonski set in the Gonski reforms. They're on track to get there or they're above it and coming back down to it. Most public schools or state schools aren't. Now, we want parents to have the choice and decide which type of schooling their children should have, government or non-government. But we want our state schools to be cathedrals of learning. Children have a right to attend a well-resourced state school. My children attended Roseview State Primary School and Bremer State High School, and they got great education at both. The Commonwealth Government provides 80% of the schooling resource standards, or the SRS, funding for non-government schools, and the states and territories provide the other 20%. For state schools, it's the reverse. The Commonwealth provides 20% of the SRS funding, and the states and territories are supposed to provide another 75%. It means a gap of about 5%. So this legislation amends the Australian Education Act of 2013, enables the Commonwealth to lift its share of funding to state schools above 20%. Removes the funding ceiling that stops the Commonwealth doing so. Means that 20% becomes the minimum, not the maximum. It enables the ratcheting up of funding. This funding will enable the government to fully fund public schools in Western Australia, Tasmania, Northern Territory and any other jurisdiction that signs up to the Albanese government's state school funding offer as part of the BFSA. It's a 10-year agreement, greater funding certainty. It's important to lock in the Commonwealth Government funding for those schools to make sure they don't go backwards. It's increasing transparency and accountability and reporting mechanism to the Parliament by the Minister on the progress of the national school education reform. The legislation enables additional funding to flow to states and territories to sign up. That's why we're putting this money towards education. It's not just about giving money, it's about making sure kids get quality standards, best teaching, best resourcing, best schooling, resourcing that they need. We want to do the same across the country that we are going to do in Western Australia, Tasmania and Northern Territory, including in my home state of Queensland. I recently met with representatives of the Queensland Teachers Union and made it crystal clear that the Commonwealth Government is prepared to increase its funding. But the Queensland Government needs to do much better. That funding is important, and it's important for what it's used for. We want children who need our help to get the most, to catch up, to keep up and to finish school. NAPLAN results tell us that 1 in 10 young people at the moment are below the minimum standard we've set, and 1 in 3 from poorer families are below that standard. At the moment, the number of children finishing high school is going backwards from 83% to 73% over the last 7 years, and that's simply not good enough. We need to fix this, we need to turn that around. Deputy Speaker, I was the first person in my family to attend high school and to complete it, let alone go to university. And I want other young people in my community to have the same opportunities that I did. And that's what this agreement's all about. The sad reality is how much your parents earn still matters. Postcode is still critical. Where you live is critical, as is the ethnic background, the religious experience you have. If you're a child from a poorer family, you're less likely to go to childcare. You're more likely to fall behind in primary school. You're more likely to not finish high school, and you're less likely to go to TAFE or university. It's the same if you're from an ethnic background or you're from an Indigenous background, if you grow up in rural and regional areas or in the bush. Our new National School Reform Agreement, the BFSA, is a real opportunity to do something about that. We want to give our kids the opportunity, the tools for success in life. One that doesn't hold anyone back and doesn't leave anyone behind. I want to make some comments about schools in my electorate and in my home state of Queensland, which has just seen a change of government following the election on the 26th of October. We have a lot of great state schools in my electorate across Ipswich, the Somerset region and the Corona Downs region. I've been proud to secure funding for upgrades to a number of local schools in recent years as part of our $270 million school upgrade fund, which is being rolled out by the Albanese government to provide school infrastructure and boost it for students. These include several projects I delivered as part of election commitments, namely $2 million for a community sports hub at Ipswich State High, which is about to be built. $100,000 for an outdoor learning space and toilets and playground upgrades at Springfield Central State School. $60,000 for a prep-safe playground at Brassel State School, and $15,000 for an audio-visual equipment upgrade at Carroll East State School. This year, in the latest round of school upgrade funds, Riverview State School in the eastern part of Ipswich received $800,000 to upgrade learning and teaching spaces, and Little Linville State School in the upper Somerset region received $850,000 to upgrade an amenities block, playground and tennis court and install a new pathway. I was very pleased to see these two smaller primary schools in working class suburbs like Riverview and Ipswich and rural Somerset region receive this much needed funding. It's small schools like these where the children attend them which need our support in particular. And that's why we went to the last election, Labor, committing to work with the states and territories to get all students an opportunity in life, to get all schools on a pathway to full and fairer funding. Delivering that $16 billion over 10 years in additional funding is critical, and it's on the table now. And of this, an additional $3.1 billion has been offered to the Queensland Government for Queensland state schools. It should be taken up. This is because it's the biggest increase in Commonwealth Government funding to state schools we've ever seen, and would mean an estimated extra $3.1 billion. Just imagine the impact that would have on regional and rural parts of Queensland. Last year, the former Queensland Labor government committed to ensure that every state school was on a path to reach 100% of the SRS. They also said that the states are in the process of lifting their funding to 75% of the SRS. Note the former government agreed share of state schools in 2024 was 70.5%, and that Queensland had lifted its funding share by 1.24% since 2018. The offer on the table had the Commonwealth offering to lift its funding share by 2.5% over the course of the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement. Further, the former state government had cited the need to provide early intervention for Queensland students. The additional Commonwealth Government funding would be tied to reforms to improve outcomes for students and their teachers, like in my community in Blair. These reforms will include initiatives to help attract and retain teachers and school leaders, in-school wellbeing coordinators and targeted supports to help students who fall behind. That's why the new Queensland Government needs to take up this offer and come to the party as well. The reforms are particularly necessary given the NAPLAN results that the Albanese government released recently showed an increase in the percentage of Queensland students who need additional support in reading. The government will introduce legislation to Parliament that will remove the funding cap that stops the Commonwealth providing additional funding to state schools, and that's what this is about. The Northern Territory and Western Australian Government have reached agreements. The new Queensland Government needs to do so as well. We need to do a lot better when it comes to this space. So in the interest of my local community and the broader Queensland community, I'm urging the new Queensland LNP Government and the new Minister for Education, John Paul Langbrook, to do the right thing and join Queensland in good faith negotiations. Or better still, just go ahead and sign the agreement to ensure full and fairer funding for state schools in Queensland and my electorate. Deputy Speaker, I'm the product of Ipswich East State Primary School during my primary education. I graduated from what was then called Bundamba State High School and now Bundamba State Secondary College, and I got a good education. I want young people to get the good education that I received.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. You know, in a small town like the one I grew up in, Coonabarabran in northwest New South Wales, schools are a really big deal. Whether it's the community-based preschool, originally built by parents back in the 70s because, hey, someone had to do it, or the Catholic school in Coona that still educates young people through to year 10, or the local infant and primary schools scattered in smaller towns like Binnaway and Barradine around the larger regional centre of Coonabarabran. Each environment is not just a place of learning for young people, but an actual beating heart for a community. For me, my learning experience was pretty much a straight run, from Coonabarabran Infant School to Coonabarabran Primary School to Coonabarabran High School. And while being part of such a small community meant everyone knew everything, I'm grateful to my public school education, to the teachers that guided and coached me along the way, and for the opportunities my education has afforded me. And yet, recently returning to my hometown, I was struck by the fact that the gap in what students there can expect to experience today may be wider than what it was for me. As with all public schools, the community out there is operating in a constant state of juggle as they try to meet every student's learning needs without the necessary funding. Meanwhile, in my community in North Sydney, while there is much I love about it, the overcrowded public infants and primary schools, which are incredibly well respected, but also generally feature demountables stacked on areas that were once green play spaces, and the lack of multiple publicly funded co-ed high schools is not on that list. Yet my community in North Sydney cares deeply about education, with the local government area of North Sydney having one of the highest concentration of educational facilities in the country, with 21 primary and secondary schools in just a 10.5 square kilometre area. Recently, we've had a couple of great new public schools open in our area, Anzac Park Primary School and Camaragal High School, which both opened their doors during 2015 and 16. And in a relatively short period of time, both of those schools have contributed significantly to our community, whilst ensuring young, bright minds across North Sydney have access to some of the best learning experiences in the country. In this context then, while I welcome this bill, which will increase the Commonwealth's minimum share of funding for public schools, I question whether it goes far enough to address what is a fundamental problem in our public education system, that being chronic underfunding. In that context, I strongly encourage the government to acknowledge the differing needs and circumstances of the states when making these funding agreements, as not all states are equal, with the state of New South Wales currently struggling to fund everything it needs following the recent GST reforms. I'd also encourage the government to go further by guaranteeing Commonwealth funding share of 25% at a minimum to make sure our public schools can meet the needs of our children regardless of where they live or their family's socioeconomic status. Since 2013, in the wake of the Gonski Review, Australia has based its goals for school funding around the Schooling Resource Standard, which estimates how much public funding is required to meet students' educational needs. Under that model, the obligations to provide the funding needed is shared by the Commonwealth and the state and territory governments, with our current agreement seeing the Commonwealth contribute a maximum of 20% to that, while states and territories contribute 75%. Now, thanks to my public school education, even I can do the maths on that and can see there is a current funding shortfall of at least 5% that has persisted from government to government. And surely after 11 years, it's time we rectify this situation. As a nation, we have a proud history of public school education, with 2/3 of all Australian students educated in our public school system. Yet 80% of the children being educated in this way currently come from families with low socioeconomic advantage. At the same time, more than 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and more than 2/3 of children with a disability are educated in the public system. And so while public schools give our children the guarantee of an education regardless of their circumstances, any short sheeting of this system ultimately is far more likely to impact people who are already vulnerable. Today, only 1.3% of public schools in Australia are fully funded. 1.3%. And that should be intolerable to our wider community. The government's Better and Fairer Schools agreement then aims to close this funding gap by raising federal funding to 22.5% of the schooling resource standard, with states covering the remaining 77.5%. And to do this, the bill amends the Australian Education Act to allow for this increased funding share. Its central provision turns what is currently a 20% Commonwealth funding ceiling into a floor, meaning the federal government would have to provide at least 20% of the schooling resource standard going forward. There is a special agreement between the Commonwealth and the Northern Territory to ensure the Commonwealth can provide 40% of funding in that region. On top of this, the bill introduces a ratchet mechanism which would ensure the Commonwealth's funding share cannot be less than the year before. And finally, the bill removes the requirement for the Commonwealth funding share to be consistent across all jurisdictions, allowing funding percentages to differ depending on the needs of the states and territories. But here's the rub. Digging further into the details of the bill, my community in North Sydney has strongly advocated for this funding increase to be supported, but many are also confused as to why the bill doesn't codify the full funding share committed in the Better and Fairer Schools agreement. For while the government has outlined its intention to fund 22.5% of the schooling resource standard, the bill sets the Commonwealth funding floor at 20%. When explaining the apparent disconnect between the legislation and the intention, the Treasurer has said the ratchet mechanism will ensure the 20% floor is effectively increased over time. But having survived in this environment for the past 2.5 years, I can't help but ask the obvious question. Why not simply raise the funding floor to align with the 22.5% agreement from the outset and avoid any risk of confusion, or better yet, lift it all the way to 25% and close the funding gap once and for all? After all, I've personally seen just how quickly good policy can be neutered by a different political ideology. And for this reason, I would encourage this government to begin in a way in which is consistent with how they would like to see the policy proceed. This year alone, public schools across the country will be underfunded on average by $2,509 per student. And every year that funding gap goes unfilled is a year our public schools do not have the resources to fully meet the educational needs of the 2.6 million students in our public school system. We need to address this issue with the urgency it requires. At the same time, however, I've also heard from teachers and experts in my electorate that the government's proposed 22.5% funding agreement doesn't account for the differing fiscal circumstances from state to state. We know different jurisdictions have different needs, and in fact the government has considered this by agreeing to move towards a 40% funding share in the Northern Territory. But in the case of my state of New South Wales, this consideration of fairness appears to have been lost. For example, compare New South Wales to WA. It's no secret WA has high revenue from its natural resources. On top of this, recent changes to the distribution of the GST revenue have given WA a much greater share, estimated to be worth somewhere between $30 and $50 billion by 2030. These extra payments to WA are initially being funded through general Commonwealth tax revenue. Yet New South Wales has received none of these magic new payments. Indeed, our GST take has decreased. Yet the Commonwealth Government is arguing our state should expect to pay no more than what WA has already agreed to take in this circumstance. And this just seems unfair and almost unnecessarily punitive to my home state of New South Wales. Our kids deserve the best education we can provide them, and this government should be more open to negotiating appropriate terms state by state. More broadly, the key message I've heard over and over from my community is that 22.5% Commonwealth resourcing share is just not enough. Public schools have now experienced more than a decade of federal promises to help meet the needs of schooling with no results. Under Julia Gillard, the Labor government promised to bring schools to 100% of funding standard over 6 years. However, the subsequent coalition government cancelled the final years of funding increases, and over the following 10 years, the total funding gap between promised public school funding and reality ballooned out to $14 billion. To add insult to injury, in 2018, the federal funding ceiling of 20% was implemented by the coalition government, locking in the funding gap that persists today. For all these reasons, the Better and Fairer Schools Agreement is an important step in addressing the current shortfall, but it leaves schools dealing with years of underfunding before reaching their goal. Ultimately, even with the 40% provided to the Northern Territory, the community there will not reach 100% of schooling resource standard until 2029. Meanwhile, public schools continue to be forced to juggle staffing shortages as teachers try to manage large class sizes with limited support, while other schools are forced to limit subject choices, reduce library services, or make cuts to essential literacy and numeracy intervention programs that help students in need. We can and must do better if we are to continue to stand as a nation that believes in public education. As the largest recipient of tax revenue, the Commonwealth Government has the capacity to close this gap much faster by ensuring future investment decisions prioritise education over things like, say, fossil fuel subsidies. Ultimately, the investment required by the federal government to immediately meet 100% of the schooling resource standard in 2024-25 would be $2.8 billion, which could either be generated by increasing the petroleum rental resource tax to an appropriate level so that those extracting our non-renewable resources are compensating our nation appropriately, or conversely, could be provided by redirecting the funding of diesel fuel subsidies for mining companies back to our schools. Because ultimately, it's important to remember that beyond the numbers, this issue is about real people, real children, and real futures. It's about schools who must make the hard decisions about which programs they can and can't afford to offer their students. It's about students in remote communities who are already working to overcome the tyranny of distance and still don't have access to the additional teaching staff they need. And it's about an essential profession in the form of teachers who can't access the materials and resources they need to provide our kids with the best possible learning experience. Ultimately, both the ask of and the opportunity for this and all future governments is clear. Commit to a minimum Commonwealth funding share of 25% of the schooling resource standard. In advocating for this position, I am joining the calls of organisations like the Australian Council of Social Service, the Australian Education Union, Save Our Schools, and countless parents and educators who recognise the need for our federal government to provide greater support in this area. At the same time, it's important that any investment in this area is not just seen as a pity move or as a sunk cost. As a recent analysis from the Australian Institute found, funding public schools at 100% of the schooling resource standard would ultimately generate the fiscal gain of $3 to $7.5 billion annually for the government over 2 decades. Education increases productivity and economic output because it enables people to build the skills and live the lives they wish to create for themselves. All we need to do to realise this gain is to take a long-term view of the value of investing in education. Ultimately, I urge this government in the strongest possible terms to listen to the experts, communities and educators on this issue and increase our federal funding commitment to at least 25% of the funding for public schools in Australia so we can meet the needs of every child, no matter where they live. Thank you.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. My Irish granny always told me, education changes lives. She would tell me stories of growing up in poverty in Northern Ireland and how she made sure her children, my mother and her brother and sisters, got a good education so they could avoid the same poverty that she grew up in. And the stories always ended with the message, education is important. Education gives you opportunities. Education means you can look after your family. She and my granddad were lifelong Labor voters because they knew that Labor supports public education. Education for everyone, not just those who can afford it. I count myself very lucky to have grown up in a family that values education and values education for girls. And I'm incredibly lucky to be living in Australia, a country we chose to come to, a country that values universal education, a country that values the high levels of literacy and numeracy that universal education brings. As we move from the information age into the digital age or the data age or the AI age, whatever the preferred term is, education will only become more important. Education helps people make sense of their world. It helps people gain skills to make the most of the opportunities that come their way. And increasingly, we know that those opportunities will be the skilled jobs that we need now and that we will need even more in the future. We want Australians to be ready for those opportunities. We want Australians to prosper as individuals and as a country. And that requires, as my Irish granny knew, education for all, so that we are all ready to grab those opportunities. Labor values education for all, which brings us to this bill. The Better and Fairer Schools Funding and Reform Bill 2024 allows the Commonwealth to deliver more funding to public schools. It puts in place protections to ensure the Commonwealth's share of public school funding can't go backwards. It also introduces new transparency reforms so that parents and school communities can see what improvements this funding is delivering to students across the country. The 2011 Gonski Review stressed the need for an equitable school funding system, that government should fund schools based on need, the School Resource Standard or SRS, and that the system should ensure that differences in educational outcomes are not the result of differences in wealth, income, power or possessions, that social disadvantage shouldn't impact educational outcomes, and that each child gets the educational opportunities according to their abilities, talents and efforts. That shouldn't be controversial. And so the Australian Government has committed to working with state and territory governments to get every school on a path to 100% of its fair funding level. The Australian Government has negotiated the Better, Fairer Schools Agreement to deliver the pathway to full funding. The agreement will run from 2025 to 2034, providing a consistent focus on key reforms for schools and teachers to implement over the next 10 years. This will see the Australian Government lifting its share for government schools in states and the ACT, if they sign up to the agreement, to 22.5% and 40% in the Northern Territory. If agreed by all states and territories, this equates to an extra $16 billion in Australian Government funding for schools. This is the biggest investment in public education by an Australian Government in this country's history. Amendments to the Australian Education Act 2013 are required to enable these new funding agreements, and this bill will enable the Commonwealth funding shares for government schools to be tailored to support the varied funding arrangements across each jurisdiction. It will set a funding floor for the Commonwealth share of government schools at 20% for 2025 and later years, and 40% for the Northern Territory government schools from 2029. It will establish a ratchet mechanism that ensures once Commonwealth share is set by regulation, it cannot be reduced without further legislative change. Because why should it be self-evident? Because it should be self-evident that the provision of good quality education to all children is a public good that benefits the whole country and should therefore be a key role for government. And so establishing this ratchet mechanism in legislation means the funding cannot be sneakily reduced without scrutiny. The bill is essential to delivering full funding to government schools, changing the current inflexible funding cap to instead be a floor. The current provisions in the Act do not allow for the Australian Government to set different shares across jurisdictions. This means that the uniform and inflexible funding cap in the Act does not allow for the varying agreed final funding shares and trajectories of jurisdictions agreed in the BFSA. This includes the increase to 40% for Northern Territory schools by 2029, 22.5% for Western Australian schools and Tasmanian schools by 2026 and 29 respectively. Legislative agreements are also required to deliver other important funding mechanisms, including the funding floor and the ratchet mechanism, which strengthen the certainty of Australian Government funding shares. The bill will also strengthen transparency and accountability of school funding, including establishing transparency and accountability in relation to funding arrangements for school education as a purpose of this Act, and require the Australian Government Minister to prepare an annual statement to Parliament relating to progress made or to be made in relation to school education reform agreements, including the BFSA. Because if you believe, as I do, that the role of government includes provision of basic community-level services such as education that help individuals but also set up our country for future success, that the role of government is about enabling the provision of public goods at a community level, providing benefit back to the individual taxpayers in both the services they directly use but also the broader standards of the community that they live in, then this is something that's worth protecting and monitoring. Deputy Speaker, Boothby has many, many fantastic schools, from Hamilton High, which I visited with the Speaker a year or so ago and features a Journey to Mars educational experience, Brighton High, which is a selective music school, Sunedin Specialist School and Springbank Secondary College, which provide inclusive education for children with disability, and so many others. I love visiting these schools and hearing from students about what they are learning, what their hopes are for the future. Our children deserve the best education that we can provide them, and our country deserves the best education. This bill gives these students and the students that follow them a great education and a great start to life. Thank you.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call a member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak briefly on the Better, Fairer Skills Bill, which is intended to address long-standing issues in the funding for Australia's public education. This bill includes three main measures. First, it amends the Australian Education Act to allow the Commonwealth to increase its funding share beyond its 20% of the school resourcing standards. This is a welcome step in addressing significant historical funding gaps, which persist more than a decade after David Gonski's landmark review. Second, the bill introduces a ratchet mechanism to ensure that the Commonwealth contributions cannot fall below that 20% baseline. This is essential for guaranteeing stability in school funding in the future. And third, this bill enables the Commonwealth's funding agreements with Western Australia, Tasmania and the Northern Territory to come into effect, even if new funding arrangements with other states are still being negotiated. Deputy Speaker, before I entered Parliament, I had the pleasure of running the Australian Business and Community Network. ABCN, as it's well known, is a non-for-profit organisation that connects workplace mentors with students from low socioeconomic schools, helping to close gaps that exist in education and workplace opportunities. It's a fantastic organisation, and through this work, I was able to see firsthand the amazing talent and dedication that exists within our public schools. Many of the schools that I worked with, I'm very proud to still be connected with, schools like Cabramatta High School, where I had the great pleasure of working with Beth Godwin, who was one of those school leaders who really inspire you in terms of the work that they do. But I also saw the challenges, the frustrations, and the need to improve how effectively and efficiently our public schools function and how to better support our educators. Since entering Parliament, I've had the privilege of witnessing the incredible work being done by public schools in my electorate of Wentworth, and I want to give a particular shout out to Rose Bay Secondary High School. But I also have seen that many of the same challenges persist. Deputy Speaker, every child, regardless of their background, deserves a good start in life. That's why public education is a priority for me, and that's why I'm campaigning for a new public high school in Wentworth. Because whilst Wentworth is fortunate to have some incredible schools and some schools that really perform really at the top of the state and certainly show enormous excellence as well as care for the students, the options for public high school education are very thin on the ground. Half of our kids in Wentworth attend a public primary school, but less than 1 in 5 continue to high school in the state system. And this isn't because there's a lack of demand, with 3/4 of parents in a recent survey saying they would prefer to send their child to a co-ed public high school. But the options aren't there for them. And, with the high cost of private schools, with private schools costing on average in Wentworth $29,000 per year for children, families are struggling with the cost of private school fees. And many families are moving out of Wentworth because of their lack of access to public education. And whilst I'm thrilled that the community pressure has delivered $42 million investment in an upgraded co-ed public high school in Randwick, it's clear we need more options. And that's why I've been working with a local architect and expert in urban school design to help develop a vision for a new high school in the east. The options are incredibly exciting, but we need the state government to back us and to plan for additional public high school in east in the future. Deputy Speaker, my commitment to public high schools and public education is also why I support all public schools reaching 100% of their SRS funding as quickly as possible. In Wentworth, data from the Australian Education Union suggests that an additional $19.1 million per year is needed to bring all our public schools up to 100% of the SRS. Statewide, the requirement is $1.8 billion per year across New South Wales. It's clear we have work to do, And because school funding is a shared responsibility, both Commonwealth and state governments need to step up. That is why this bill is a step forward. But I do have some concerns, both with this legislation and with the funding agreements being negotiated alongside it. Firstly, while the bill makes some important changes, the deals negotiated with the state so far mean that public schools in Western Australia and Tasmania are not due to be fully funded until 2029. Public school students need to be fully funded sooner rather than later, and further delays risk depriving students of essential support, resources and opportunities. Secondly, I'm concerned about a potential lack of accountability mechanisms if states or territories do not keep their side of the bargain. It's one thing to set a target, it's another to make sure it is met. Without proper accountability measures in place, there is a risk that these funding commitments could continue to fall short. Third, as noted by the Productivity Commission, the previous National Schools Reform Agreement did little to improve the overall school student outcomes. That's why it's critical that future funding agreements made under this bill must be about more than just money. We have, as a country, invested tens of billions of dollars of more money into public education since the Gonski Review, and I support that investment. However, we are not seeing results in terms of the outcomes for our students, from educational outcomes, but also from wellbeing outcomes. You see that Australia has had a steady decline in its PISA scores over the past 2 decades, with performance in maths declining 37 points since 2006, equivalent to almost 2 years of schooling, and performance in reading literacy falling 30 points, equivalent to 1.5 years of schooling. This is us as a country going backwards in terms of the educational outcomes of each generation of children, and that is a problem. National NAPLAN scores are no better, with the latest results showing that 1 in 3 Australian school students are performing below literacy and numeracy benchmarks. There's a lot of talk of productivity in this country, and I think this is certainly an example where we have spent more money, but we are not getting better results. And this is an enormous challenge for us as a country. We need to make sure that the funding agreement set out in this bill drives real, measurable improvements in student performance and wellbeing, and ensure that resources are allocated in ways that genuinely benefit students and staff. As the Productivity Commission set out in its 2022 review of the NRSA, we need to support quality teaching and effective school leadership by reducing low-value tasks and out-of-field teaching, better disseminating best practices, and producing evidence-based resources for teachers to use in the classroom. I saw these firsthand when I was running ABCN, where I spoke to incredibly passionate and effective teachers who said more and more, and school leaders as well, who were spending more and more of their time on low-value administrative tasks and not having the same time and energy for their classroom, when we know that a great teacher and the relationship between a student and a teacher is what makes an enormous difference. So I think we have to make sure that our teachers can spend more time on the differences they can make to our students rather than on administrative tasks. That also applies to evidence-based resources. Again, I met to many teachers who were reinventing the wheel year after year in their schools, trying to cobble together great resources for their students. We have one curriculum in New South Wales. There's no reason why we shouldn't have truly excellent curriculum resources that all teachers can draw on and adopt if they adapt and adopt differently to their classroom. But we need to have better resources for our teachers, so that they can bring the best of themselves to that relationship with students. Secondly, from the Productivity Commission review, we need to support all students to achieve basic levels of literacy and numeracy, with which specific targets and measures to accompany this ambition. Because if students don't leave each year with appropriate levels of literacy and numeracy, they will fall further and further behind, and their opportunities post-school are too limited. This has to be a real focus just on getting those basics right. And we do need to reduce the differences in achievements across students by supporting those students who face particular challenges. Because, Australia, we have some great and wonderful high performers, but we do have, students who are not performing, at that basic level. If we can lift them up, this makes a difference, to our education outcomes, but it makes a difference to people's lives and the opportunities they can have in the future. These are the kind of essential productivity reforms that must form a core part of future funding agreements. And this is, what I am imploring the government to do is to learn from some of the experiences of places like in the UK, where they really focused on the evidence for learning. I know that the government has made investments in this place, but this needs to be the piece, the sort of evidence for learning and evidence of actually what makes a difference in the classroom, such as phonics instruction. If we can adopt that widely across our education system, then we have a greatest chance of improving the outcomes for our students. So again, this is the piece I will be urging the government to do, is make sure that the states who control what actually happens in the classroom will deliver on things that will make our students learn better and actually improve the productivity of our education system, improve the outcomes of the education system, not just give the education system more money. My fourth concern, Deputy Speaker, is that this bill does not address the accounting loopholes that currently exist in our school funding arrangements. These loopholes allow states to allocate up to 4% of total SRS funding towards areas unrelated to schools. These include public transport, capital depreciation and regulatory bodies. In 2019, Labor indicated from opposition that it would address this issue, but it appears that these loopholes may be allowed to persist under this bill. And finally, my biggest concern is that funding agreements have not been reached with New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. Without agreements in place, public school funding is at risk from the beginning of next year. This would be a devastating outcome for students, teachers and families in these states. And so I strongly urge both the states and the Commonwealth to return to the negotiating table as soon as possible. I note that the Commonwealth has come up with a significant investment and has put a significant investment on the table for the schools, and I urge the states to accept this and work with the Commonwealth on this. I urge them collectively to deliver a pathway to 100% SRS funding for our public schools that is both equitable and prompt. Our students deserve no less. Thank you.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call a member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak in favour of this bill, but also with an ask. As I stand here, Deputy Speaker, my daughter Daisy is actually in her first transition session to her new primary school, and I will acknowledge that in 10 minutes I've locked in a FaceTime with Daisy to see how it went. Daisy and 3 of her kinder friends will have started their transition program for Camp Hill Primary School. Primary school, a public school in the heart of Bendigo. We are quite spoilt for choice in Bendigo in terms of our big network of independent and Catholic and public schools. But Daisy and her 4 kinder friends are not alone. 60% of her kinder class will go to public schools in our area. And what frustrates me the most as I stand here to speak on this bill is that those children, all children going to public schools, will not receive 100% of the resource standard. That the children in her class going to Catholic and independent schools will. And I think about the journey that so many families are going on, those anxious times when their little ones start to enter primary school. It is a big transition moment, not just for the children, but for their families. And to know that that school is not going to get the same resources as the other kinder kids who are going to independent and Catholic schools is unfair. And I say this with an ask to say to all of us in this place and to our colleagues in state governments, that is on us. That is on us. We cannot hide behind the rhetoric that it is a Liberal government that is holding back our schools, that will not fund them properly. It is on us. And so within my speech, I'd like to make an ask and an encouragement to our Labor ministers at a state and federal level to work this one out. We know that the system is unfair. We know that our public schools are receiving less money than they should. And if we want to live up to the ideal that every school student gets 100% of the resource standing, that it is not your postcode that determines your school and education outcome, then we have to get this right. I do speak in favour of this bill because it does allow the Commonwealth to deliver more funding to public schools. It also puts protections in place to ensure the Commonwealth gets its fair share of public school funding, and it can't go backward. It introduces a floor for what that should be, that 20%, and allows the government to negotiate each individual arrangements in each of the states to deliver the funding. And I do believe that the Minister for Education in our government is genuine and in there fighting to ensure that we get to the resource standard for our public schools. To ensure that every kid has access to the resources that they need to be successful, our schools need this funding. It is critical. It is critical for schools that might have a big makeup of children from a low socioeconomic background, culturally diverse background, students with a disability, that these schools get this funding. But it's also about ensuring that the school has the resources to deliver not just the basics, but the extracurricular activities that keeps kids engaged. We've all got those experiences of going out to primary schools and seeing schools and secondary schools and seeing the schools of independent schools that can put on great, grand school productions, and then the public school up the road, because of the funding that they receive and because of the demographic makeup of their students, they just don't have the capacity to put on those productions. Productions is just one example of the inequity that exists within our schools. The ability to retain teachers, the ability to be able to have up-to-date equipment, the ability to ensure that we've got all the support structures in place. School funding is critical. And it isn't just an impact that happens today, it becomes a legacy issue. You could trace back the challenges that we have with school funding back to the Howard era and the divergence that we saw happen within our education system. We are unfortunately seeing an increased bleed of students from the public system to the independent and Catholic system when it gets to the secondary school level. And I noticed that in my own electorate. That is why this bill is so critical. It's about putting a line in the sand and saying this is the new floor, and we hope to work it out to get the extra funding flowing to our schools. The Australian government is committed to working with the states and territories to ensure that every school is on the path to 100%. It's a fair funding level, the school resource standard, recommended by Gonski all those years ago. It allows the government to negotiate a better, fairer funding agreement with each of our states. We know that there is agreements that have been reached in the Northern Territory, Tasmania and WA. And yes, I appreciate the bigger states with the high number of students, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria are to go. I strongly urge all governments to get together to work this one out. If all states agree, this equates to an additional $16 billion from the Australian government alone to go into schools. It represents the biggest investment in public education by the Australian government in its history. It amends the Australian Education Act 2013 to enable these funding arrangements to occur, and that is the bill that's before us. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the schools in my electorate. Being a regional electorate, I have lots of schools, very large schools to quite small schools. Bendigo Senior Secondary is the largest VC in the state of Victoria. It's Year 11 and Year 12, and last Thursday had the biggest cohort of students in the state of Victoria sitting the education exam. To the very smallest schools of Langley, which has 3 students, a primary school. There are great public schools with a fantastic teaching network trying to do what they can. And I know that with this extra funding, they'll be able to support all students achieve an outcome. One of the things that you can do with having the resources is to be able to run a program like the Net School program, which the senior secondary school does. So for students who've disengaged, for students who are at risk of dropping out or have dropped out, they get them together on a campus off-site from the main senior secondary campus and run a program that engages with them, getting them re-engaged through art, through sport, through other activities. It is literally a net school that catches kids that are falling through the holes, the gaps. It's a model that works, but the school says to me is only possible to be funded because they have a large student cohort. Funding by getting to the resource standard of 100% guarantees that they will always have the resources to keep such a program for going. They say that they save lives, but I believe that they are also helping us to stop the statistic of 1 in 5 adult Australians not having the numeracy, literacy and life skills required to work in this country. This school helps children transition to a career, whether it be at TAFE, back into VCE or into work. It's a model that works, and other schools could roll out something similar if they had the resources. This legislation helps all of our small regional country schools who have smaller student numbers. So increased resource standard means that they have more money in their budget. They don't have to make that choice between an art class or a garden program. They have the ability to do both. They don't have to rely upon donations for pencils or for paper to be able to do their art classes or their other classes. These are the types of differences that this makes. We have an amazing network of Catholic and independent schools in my electorate, and when I've spoken to Sandhurst Catholic Education Department, as well as my independent schools, they agree with this legislation. They too want to see all schools get to that 100% resource standard. They don't want to see the competition that's in place because they see the importance of having well-funded public schools in our area. This bill is critical, Deputy Speaker, to helping to ensure the investment required for our public schools for every student, not just Daisy, my daughter Daisy, and the next generation of young primary school students, but every primary school student and secondary student currently studying in our public school system and every future student going into our system. This bill delivers for regional schools, it will deliver for Victorian schools, but again, in my closing remarks, it's on us, and I really call upon our education ministers to work this one out.
I thank the member. The time being approximately 1 o'clock, the Federation Chamber is now suspended and will resume when the Chair is resumed later this afternoon.